My name is Laura Stoner, and I'm welcoming Phil Wilayto to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. It is December 1st, 2023, and we're here to talk about your activism in the Vietnam War and beyond. And I'm going to start by asking you your full name.
Full name, Philip Henry John Wilayto.
Is there a reason you have two middle names, or?
Yeah, my father was Henry John Wilayto. They named me Philip Henry, and then in Catholic confirmation, you take an extra name. So that's John. So
Okay.
I wanted that to be like my dad's. So, but I go by Phil.
Okay. When were you born?
January 8th, 1949,
And where were you born?
Watertown, Massachusetts.
And who were your parents?
Well, let's see. Henry John Wilayto was the son of Polish immigrants, and his mother died from an illegal back alley abortion when he was 8 years old, and he grew up in foster homes. And he got out when he was 16 at the height of the Depression, and bounced from one job to the next, and finally gave up and joined the army. They sent him to the Philippines, and the war broke out, and he was part of the Battle of Bataan and Corregidor, survivor of the Bataan Death March, 4 years in prison camp, tortured, abused, malnutrition, malaria, and part of the underground resistance that carried out sabotage against the Japanese military. And came out and was one of the three founders of the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor Veterans Organization, and wound up on the Presidential Commission on POWs and MIAs. And when he died, the Boston Globe ran a half-page story on him. And my mother was the daughter of children of immigrants, so her grandparents were immigrants. Um, and she grew up in a good, stable household, and her father was a printer and a union organizer. And they worked through the Depression because people wanted to read newspapers, but she had a sister and two brothers. And eventually, Grandpa fell under the influence of the bottle and drifted away, and Grandma went to work in a factory, which she really liked because she was working outside the home and with women and bringing in her own money and not having to worry when the rent money was going to wind up at the horse track. And Ma went to started out as a domestic worker, as all the women did. Most Irish women did at that time. Her parents were English and Irish and Scottish. And then she went to work for the telephone company and wound up volunteering to go to Washington, D.C. during the war when they had a big influx. So she was part of that whole wave of women who moved to service the war industry, the war effort, and had a lot of amazing experiences. Ran into Eleanor Roosevelt one time, and stood by Dad during his time in captivity, and then when he came out, raised 5 kids, and lived to 103. She just passed a year ago.
What a nice.
An amazing woman. Down at this local senior center, she held her own at the coffee clashes with professors and doctors and attorneys, and would never let me slip by with a sloppy fact when we were arguing politics. Lightly, because we mostly were on the same side.
So your parents, did they marry before he went?
No, no, and they weren't even engaged. As far as Dad was concerned, that was it. He was, Ma was the one. And as far as Ma was concerned, well, we'll see what happens, after the
So
war.
they knew each other before he went?
Yeah, they went together.
Uh-huh.
They went together.
But they
They went
weren't-
together in the summer.
Okay.
In the winter, he would disappear. And she got pretty miffed, and she finally decided to drop him until he explained that if he didn't have money, he didn't want to come and see her because he didn't have anything to take her out with. So the winters, those were slow for him. So he just didn't see her. but it was love at first sight on his side. And yeah, it
Did
was.
she know? Like, Did the Red Cross do anything for them?
She got a couple of letters. Um, he wrote a lot, but very few of the letters got through. But she told me that she felt like he really was, she kind of knew he was the one. When he came home, she was actually seeing a lieutenant. She had a date and she canceled the dates, saw him, and he proposed, and that was it.
Well, I guess that puts everything in an
Oh,
experience
yeah.
like that puts everything in perspective.
And they were together, 63 years. So
So then what did he do after he got out?
he went to college on the GI Bill. He wanted to get into radio broadcasting. He interviewed Jack Kennedy when he was running for the U.S. Senate. But he blew the whistle on a payola scheme at the station and, kicked back for playing music, and they fired him. So he went back to school and went into middle management for a couple of different companies, wound up working for Honeywell. Um, and, uh, and then after that, when he retired, he did consulting work. And a lot of the work, a lot of the volunteer work with the veteran organizations. So
So now, where did you attend high school?
I went to a Catholic seminary. I went in at the age of 13. I thought I wanted to become a priest. And the church thought that I was going to become a priest too. So I stayed 5 years, the high school and the first year of college. And then we parted ways. Actually, they kicked me out. We took an unauthorized weekend out of, yeah, we were up in Niagara Falls, Ontario was where the college was. So three of us skipped out one Friday night, went to Toronto, had a wonderful time, saw my first mini skirt. We came home and one of the guys threatened to turn us in. So we went down and talked to the president and said, we just, we're sorry. And he said, well, appreciate your courage and your honesty, and you have to be out by noon. So,
So that changed your plan.
well, I was planning on leaving anyway. I mean, and that was why he told us to leave. He knew all three of us. The three of us who went, everybody left. I mean, out of like 150 students, 2 became priests. So it was that time of turmoil in the church. A conflict between some priests and other clergy who were, had a strong social justice consciousness, and a church that was very conservative. And, after a while, it just seemed like, being in the church structure would be a hindrance to trying to do any kind of social justice work rather than a help. So, yeah.
And did you have any siblings? I'm sorry, that's.
Yeah, I have an older sister and a brother and 2 sisters that are younger than me. Yeah, and, Dad's big thing was education. And he felt like that was the ticket to moving up in society. And he promised all his kids that they'd have a college education. So he never made more than $30,000 a year in his life. But they all got a college education. And I went from the Mount Carmel College to Boston College for 2 years, and then I quit. So I'm the only one that didn't finish. And that had to do with the war.
So what year did you graduate from high school?
That would have been 66.
66.
Yeah.
And so had you heard about the Vietnam War and the conflicts in Vietnam at that point?
Yeah, I remember the first time, I guess I was I 17, 18? I was taking a bus trip out to Chicago, and I was sitting next to a guy who had just done a tour in Vietnam, and he was going back for a second tour. And I asked him why, and he said because it was a terrible incident I don't have to go into, but one of his friends was captured and tortured, and he was going back for personal reasons. And that was the first time I talked to anybody who had been there. And I was just sort of, generally felt like, war was not a good thing. But yet everybody in my neighborhood either went to college or went into the military. We were sort of, working class, lower middle class. And so depending if your family had any money, that was the career path. So and of course, my dad's experiences, my two uncles, on from my mother's brothers, and my father's two brother-in-laws. Well, one was in the military and one was in defense industries. But the military was a big tradition. Um, but in general, back in when I left the seminary, it was '67, and it was controversial at that point, but not as much as it was later on. And then when I was still in high school, um, one of our more conscious priests used to bring us to an ecumenical center in Boston. The junior seminary was in Hamilton, Massachusetts, and there would be speakers. It was a house, and it was a kind of a meeting place for people from the Jewish Christian community to come together and talk about social issues. And there's one time there was a young man there who had burned his draft card, and he explained how he and a couple of others went up in front of the Boston State Capitol and made an announcement to some news media and burned the cards. And there happened to be a field trip from South Boston High School visiting the Capitol at the same time. So there was a large group of young white Irish American kids. And that's a very reactionary area of the city. And they attacked the small group of war protesters and beat them as the police stood by and watched. And listening to him, I was just absolutely fascinated. I mean, I grew up, average height, skinny, dyslexia, um, neurotic. My dad had PTSD, and I was the oldest son, so it often,
He
you know,
worked a lot of his feelings out.
yeah,
Your
he beat
family.
me, and so I was kind of a mess at that time. And to think that this kid was older than me, of course, a couple of years older, but that he would stand there and take this beating out of principle. It was just like, I don't know, it's almost like Christ-like. It really impressed me. And we're all idealists anyway. I mean, people who decide to become a priest when they're 13 years old, you know, they're, you know, they're not real pragmatic. So, yeah, so I was thinking about the war, and in the first year of college, we started a little coffee house, and I wrote a play about the war, and we tried to set up a debate. So we had one priest who, we have invited two faculty members. So one priest said, war is a terrible thing, but we're fighting communism, and we're there, and we have to stay. And then when we leave, we should try to make sure that the people are taken care of. So the one who was against the war said, war is a terrible thing, but we're there, and we can't just leave. But when we do leave, we should try to make things better for the people there. So I really thought there was something missing from the debate. And so when I got to Boston College, of course, that was a different scene. Boston was a big center for the anti-war movement. So that summer between Mount Carmel and Boston College was when Henry Kissinger, the great statesman who everyone is now praising, had just threatened to drop nuclear weapons on North Vietnam. And there was a protest called. And I said, well, I don't know how I feel about the war completely, but, that I can understand. So I went on this march, and it was thousands of people, and they marched through the streets, and I went by myself, and it was just, and we marched to Arlington Street Church, and people were giving anti-war talks, and then at one point the chair made an announcement that a U.S. warplane had just been shot down over North Vietnam, and off to the right, this little group of young people started cheering, and I went, whoa. They're cheering because a U.S. plane was shot down? I thought we were against war, and isn't that our side? So that really, but I was fascinated. So within a year, I was out on the streets chanting, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF are going to win. But while I was in college, I joined the local chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and we put out a little mimeograph newsletter called Mother Pie and Applewood. Um, and that was, the anti-war outreach on campus. And I had an English professor who assigned us an essay, Vietnam, Right or Wrong. And we were supposed to really research the subject, and I did. And I remember one book I read quoted a U.S. colonel who had gone over the interrogation reports from prisoners of war, and he said, if what these prisoners are saying is true, we're on the wrong side. And that kind of impressed me. And then reading about, the history of the situation, and seeing that, we were supporting a corrupt dictatorship, that was very brutal and hated by the people, and that Ho Chi Minh had originally, approached the United States government for support in throwing off the Japanese occupation, and then the French. It was the French, and then during World War II, it was the Japanese occupation. And the French came back, and the U.S. supported the French. And Ho Chi Minh was leading the independence struggle and approached the U.S. and asked for help, and they refused. And he based his Declaration of Independence on the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and he was rebuffed. So I decided after writing the essay that Vietnam was wrong. And the next day I went out to join the weekly silent vigil against the war in Vietnam. And we stood there in the snow while the jocks went by and threw snowballs at us and calling us cowards. And that was the bravest thing I'd ever done up to that point, which I thought was really ironic. Even got a picture in the yearbook. So from then on, and then there was my sister was going with this guy who turned out to be a real phony and jerk, but pretended he was an anti-war activist. But he used to say, Phil, every night before you go to bed, you remind yourself that 30 GIs died in Vietnam, and what did you do to stop it? He wasn't concerned about the Vietnamese. But it got to me, and I knew that in South Boston, where kids didn't go to college, they had the highest, one of the highest recruitments into the military in the entire country. And I began to feel that the student deferment that I had was really a class privilege, and that I didn't want it. I didn't want to be in school anyway. I was only in school for the deferment. I really wanted to go out and live on a hippie commune somewhere.
Well, how are your parents feeling about your activities at school at this point?
Oh, Dad and I were, I lived at home the first year in college, and things got so tense that at one point we almost came to blows, and I left and went, living off campus. So he was outraged that I was against the war and criticizing the military. At one point, I told him that I would never become a businessman. It was just awful. But as the years went by, Ma joined another Mother for Peace, and Dad's when he was at Honeywell, towards the end of the war, they had a company newsletter, and they interviewed a couple of people about their views on the war. So they interviewed Dad because they wanted someone who was for the war, and he said that if my sons were being drafted, I would personally drive them to Canada. So I'd already lived in Canada, so I wasn't interested in going to Canada.
So what did the leaving school and losing your deferment, what did that mean to you?
I thought it meant I was going to prison. Yeah.
And you were prepared to go to prison?
Well, it took a little while, see? I mean, like I said, I was a neurotic little kid. I was the kid who got picked on in school. Going to the seminary was good because they didn't actually beat you up. They just, humiliated you in various ways. But they didn't actually beat you. So that was
It was a peaceful time for you.
Yeah, in retrospect, I really was religious, but in retrospect, I think I wanted to get away from my father.
Because you left home at 13.
At 13, yeah.
You were at boarding, basically kind of a boarding school.
Yeah, it was a boarding school. And it was great. It was $300 a year, boardroom and books. So it was a break for my folks, and it brought peace to the house. And the whole family would come visit me once a month. and we'd go out to a Chinese dinner and then go out to a park and throw a football. And Dad was real proud that I was going to be a priest and so on. So it cleared up a lot of things, except during the summers. Um, so yeah, so here I am in school and in college, and
What was your major when you were at Boston College? Had you
I
declared one?
majored in psychology. I wanted to be a clinical psychologist and live in an apartment in Beacon Hill and drive a little black sports car and play guitar in coffee houses. That was my goal in life.
Were you going to wear a black turtleneck too?
No, no. That was, beatnik style or faux beatnik style. No, I was looking for authenticity. So, but I couldn't afford all the authentic clothes, so I was only like halfway there.
Okay.
But yeah, so I had to get out of college. I said, what am I doing here? I'm just avoiding the draft. So let's get out of the draft. That was my first thought. So my first idea was to join Navy ROTC, which for some reason I thought would keep me out of the military. I was, I was like slowly developing, intelligence. And
Well, I mean, I do think there's a reason why they put young men in the military. Their willingness to do things, like the thought processes aren't
yeah,
necessarily rational or fully
sure,
developed at that time.
sure.
So
Yeah,
I'm sure,
their frontal lobes are
yeah.
stunted. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you couldn't ask the average person to, fully grown adults to go out and risk your life for U.S. corporations, that don't pay taxes. That's a hard sell. So, but you get a kid, it's like, you want to be a man. Okay, sure, of course I do. So, but anyway, I decided to get out of the draft. So I went to a doctor, and he checked me out. And he said, there's nothing wrong with you. So I went to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, why do you want to get out of the military? I said, because I don't want to go to Vietnam. He says, well, you're obviously not crazy. So then there was another psychiatrist, Dr. Harvey Chernoff, who the word was if you paid him $300, he would give you a letter saying you were gay. So I went to see him, but the line was so long, I got discouraged after about 3.5 hours and I left. And
But
that,
is there some sort of, you're involved in these communities of anti-war. Are they telling you where to go and what to do? Or,
well, it was, I was on campus. I mean, all I knew what was on campus, but, everybody, all the guys on campus were, worried about, is the war still going to be going on when I get out and lose my 2S student deferment? So this is what made the war real for so many people. If it had been an all-volunteer military, it never would have had the same, effect on masses of people. Which is why I feel a little guilty about working against the draft for so long. But yeah, so I finally got down to conscientious objection was the only ones that I could think of, and then you have to be against all wars, and I wasn't against all wars. I would have fought a just war. I would have fought to defend the country, or
so you're still feeling patriotic about your country.
Um, well, in some ways, Pete Seeger had a song at that time called "If You Love Your Uncle Sam, Bring Him Home, Bring Him Home. Support our boys in Vietnam, Bring Him Home, Bring Him Home." And that's kind of where I was. So I finally decided, if I was going to be true to myself, I just had to quit school and take my chances with the legal system. So I was working. I had part-time jobs while I was in school, and one of them was cleaning out a meat market in the South End. And so I'd go down there in the evening, and then I'd have to walk a fairly long way through an industrial area to the subway, and there was nobody there, and it was dangerous. So I would do it on purpose to try to
Get an injury or?
get a little stronger,
Oh,
get a
okay.
little psychologically stronger. I carried a sharpened pencil, which also shows I wasn't totally practical at the time. But finally, I got to the point where I thought I could handle it, and I quit. I quit school, and I was reclassified 1A, and
Did you have a draft did you get a draft number?
I got reclassified 1A, which meant I was eligible to be drafted.
Okay,
So it was just a matter of time.
okay,
So I went down to, I was looking for a group to work with. Like I said, because of my dad, I felt like if I was going to be against the war, I had to really do something against the war. I couldn't just be, looking out to get out of the draft myself. I had to take on the war, if that was the issue. So there was the American Friends Service Committee. I knew about them. They had a lovely little office down on Longfellow Path, and it had a cobblestone path up to the front door and flowers all around. It was really pretty. And then there was the Boston Draft Resistance Group, which was in a grubby, grimy old industrial office building off of Central Square. So I went to the Boston Draft Resistance Group, and I walked in and I said, I want to volunteer to help. And they said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, sweep the floor, counsel people, overthrow the government, whatever you got. And they said, so they handed me a broom and asked me to sweep the floor. And I went to work with them for $40 a week. And that lasted 6 weeks. That was the only time I ever got paid for political work. There was some internal struggles and they collapsed as an organization. But in the meantime, they trained me in counseling, and I was counseling people on how to get out of the draft, which was interesting. And we'd also go to what we call the early morning shows, where guys would be picked up on a bus and brought down to the Army base to be processed. And we would go to the Army base and stand in front of the guys and make a speech about how you didn't have to go in. There was ways to get out of the draft, and you shouldn't be, this is a bad war, and so on and so forth. And I found that I really enjoyed getting up in front of a crowd and just speaking, agitationally. So I'm 20. It was young, but things were developing, but then I realized basically what I was doing. I was getting people who were against the war and against the military out of the military. Whereas if they went into the military, they might have, had some kind of internal influence or disruption or something. And I felt like, and then I would ask these guys, what are you going to do when you get out? And they said, oh, I'm going to go on unemployment, smoke pot. And I was like, what am I doing? So that was, we did have a little campaign to try to force people to quit the local Cambridge Draft Board by picketing their homes and businesses, but that didn't last for long. But it was interesting, called Project Off. But it was an organizing thing as opposed to, the counseling. So then I heard that there was a group started up that was training people in military counseling to go into GI organizing. And at that time, I was living above the office of the Draft Resistance Group there were two people living there, a young woman and a young man, and the man's name was Glenn Hoffman. And Glenn was kind of on his way out. I think the enormity of the war and the suffering had just gotten to him, and he was becoming unable to function in the movement and probably, in society in general. So I think he was recruiting me to take his place. This is what I really think. So every night we would sit on the floor in the living room, make a pot of Irish breakfast tea, which I still drink today, even though I found out it's made in England. And Glenn would tell me stories about the Molly Maguires and the Russian Revolution and the Homestead Steel Strike and all these, he was giving me political history. And so I said, as we realized the group was going to, fold, I said, well, what is there to do? He says, well, there's this area, there's labor work and there's environmental work. He said, or, you could join the GI movement. I said, what's that? He says, well, you go to a military town and start a coffee house and attract GIs and put out a newspaper and bail each other out of jail. And I said, well, that sounds pretty good. Because he said, I remember he said to me, what do you want to do with your life? I said, I want to fight dragons. He said, well, the U.S. military is the biggest dragon there is. Why don't you fight that?
So you were saying that you were looking to fight the military and the big dragon. And so you were talking to this man um, that was giving you the information about what you could do with your life.
Right.
Um, and so he suggested a coffee house and a newspaper.
Yeah.
And so that was that your plan? Or
Well, I mean, I figured you went and knocked on somebody's door and they'll let you in. What wasn't the way it was. There was this group, Legal In Service Project, that was training people in military law. Apparently, I mean, my understanding at the time was that there was no place you could go outside of the military to study military law. So these folks had studied it themselves and then were training other people. So I took the courses, and then through that group, we heard that there were two couples living in Newport, Rhode Island, who wanted to start a GI organizing project. And there were like 30 of these around the country, and some of them in Germany and Japan. And there was a network and so on. So there was, a structure. So they had a little money, and they were willing to fund a project. So
you did the legal in service project in Cambridge.
in Cambridge, right,
Massachusetts, but then this is like moving to Newport,
right,
Rhode Island.
right. So I went down and met with them, and they were willing to fund setting up. We decided on a bookstore rather than a coffee house because a bookstore had income. Because this is before Amazon. So if you wanted a leftist book, you couldn't go to Barnes and Noble. You had to go to a leftist bookstore. So we went and just recruited people. I just, in some cases, literally off the street, and a couple of people who had been active in GI organizing or counseling work in Chicago heard about us, and they came down. So we wound up with a collective of about, I think there were six of us.
So
And
would the GIs come to your group and say, I don't want to be in this anymore? And then
well, see, we set up a bookstore, and the bookstore was like a little oasis for people who were anti-military. And we started putting on a newspaper. There was an official publication called All Hands. This was the Navy. So we put out All Hands Abandoned Ship. And people were at these organizing projects were publishing newspapers. And so we learned how to put out a newspaper. It was, pretty basic.
But to disseminate the newspaper, did you
Yeah.
have to have someone who was in the military who was sympathetic to take it in? Or did
Well,
you?
we would pass it out. We'd get out in front of the Navy YMCA, pass it out there. We'd go out to the base at the entrance, to the base, and stand there. And when people drove out, we hand them the paper. We set up distribution in 60 sites around the city and around Narragansett Bay. So we would, it came out monthly. I think we published 8,000 copies. So people would come to the bookstore. And of course, in addition to the anti-war message, there was the counterculture. We had long hair, the guys had long hair, there were young women. There were, the newspaper was funny. It was interesting. We didn't encourage sabotage because that would be illegal, but we ran 2 pages of reports on people who had done sabotage. It was called the spider web. It had a big spider web and these little articles. And people would say, I was sitting in my barracks and there was a shore patrol truck outside, so I lit up a Molotov cocktail and dropped it on the back of the truck. So we put that in the paper. And we eventually ran a sink your ship photo contest. Now we said. It was a lot more fun in those days. We said, we're not encouraging you to sink your ship. But if you do, send in a photo. And the winning photo will get a year's subscription to the newspaper. So we got one entry. It was a guy, his ship was docked in Barcelona, Spain. And he said, I went into the after engine room and opened up a valve and the water came in and the ship listed 3 degrees to the side and they couldn't deploy. But, we thanked them for the entry, but we said we had to disqualify him because he didn't send in a photo. So then, let me see. I'd like to tell you this story. can I do this? Um, I was not involved in this, but an interesting thing happened. Um, every year, the military celebrates Armed Forces Day, and the GI movement would celebrate Armed Forces Day. And there was like an anarchist trend through a lot of the, it was like one of my anarchist friends says, "Why are you trying to organize the military? They were already organized." But there were different political, tendencies, and some that were more class conscious, some of them that were just general, disrupt things, some of them that, were Marxist. And so you had these different, thoughts bouncing off each other. And there were conferences and there were arguments and debates and so on. But there's one particular day, someone who's traveling around through different organizing projects. I don't know, just they were an activist and they wanted to see what else. It was a young woman, and she said, there was just this action up in I think Portland, where to protest the U.S. bombing of the or laying mines at Haiphong Harbor, in order to cut off all. Yeah, and it was, the people were really suffering. They laid fake mines across Portland Harbor, and they got a lot of publicity on it. And you should do something like that. And then she left. So anyway, as it turned out, on Armed Forces Day, a note was left under the door of the Newport Daily News, saying that it was a note from the local underground called the Newport Liberation Front, the NLF, which happened to be the same. It's the National Liberation Front. It said, early this morning, your harbor was mined. The mines are set to activate in 3 days unless three conditions are met. Stop the war in Vietnam, get the Navy out of Newport, and release all prisoners of war, that is, Newport sailors, second class and below. So we drove out to the harbor, and there was a string of red and black balloons going right across the harbor. And there was the Navy, the frogmen, and the Coast Guard, and the local police, and the FBI, and I think the CIA, and there was a helicopter overhead. So I was with John Porter. He had a nice pickup truck, and we drove down to take a look at this, and got quite a chuckle out of that, and went back home and sat down and broke open a six-pack, and listening to the radio, and all of a sudden, we interrupt this program to bring you this special announcement. 10 minutes ago, the Chester A. Pauling, a gasoline barge from New York City, was passing under the Newport Jamestown Bridge and had an explosion in its forward end. There is no information at this time if there's any connection with the so-called bombing of mining of Newport Harbor this morning. Stay tuned for details. So John sat down heavily in his easy chair and went, "Oh shit." So a second note was delivered to the newspaper, said that from the NLF, saying they had nothing to do with the bombing. It turned out it was just an accident, but they would have felt bad if anybody had gotten hurt, just sailors, just working people, just like the folks up in Haiphong Harbor. That made page 27 of the New York Times. There was a write-up of Armed Forces Day, but that was the lead. So there's a little group that felt that, they were unable to respond to, they were at a low point in their organizing campaign. So I'm reading, the Newport. And a friend of ours who was a sailor was hitchhiking in Florida. He got picked up by a cop who actually took him to the next stop. And when he found out he was from Newport, he said, "Wow, you're from Newport. That's where those guerrillas just blew up a Navy ship." So you see how things get distorted. So anyway, that was one thing that came out of Newport, which I had nothing to do with, but it was
Can I ask you
interesting.
a question about activism? In that we had Ben Ragsdale come and speak to us, and he was kind of an activist that came out of the civil rights movement, and they're kind of like that. They protested very in a very respectful way. They were very, into going and having marches in DC, and, you know, they had signs with the names of people who had died in Vietnam, and they, like threw them, they threw them over, like in a symbolic way that these people were being lost. Um, and then we talked to another man, Mr. Summers, and he was more of a hippie, but he kind of had like this brush with the yippie movement, where they had the flag and it was more kind of like boisterous and irreverent and um, not as organized in their protesting. Um, so it's kind of interesting to think about, you think about anti-war activism, it just kind of goes like, you are or you aren't, you're doing this, but it seems like there's more shades
Oh, yeah.
to activism
Oh, sure.
and how people let it affect their lives and, that kind of thing. I'm just
Yeah.
asking for a general, like, that's a big overarching question, and like how that touches your life and your experience.
I mean, there was, I mean, I went through a personal political development, and in the beginning, we were very gloriously self-righteous, as one friend of mine put it. We were fighting this great monster, and we were part of a worldwide struggle, and we just felt like, that was so great. And any little bit of repression we might have faced just validated that. We were proud of it. We were in Newport. We were under surveillance. The couple also, one of them owned the psychiatrist owned a house, and they turned over. It was a two-story house, and they turned over the upper floor to us, and we paid like $95 a month rent for 4 or 5 bedroom house. So it was a little collective, and there was a rotating shift of law enforcement outside the window, sitting in a park bench, until we drove up one night and shined our headlights in that particular guy's face, and then got out and sat on either side of him and asked him if he was with the local police or the Naval Intelligence Service or the FBI. He left, and they stopped coming around. But they tapped our phones, picked up the phone one day. I heard a voice say, they're using their phone now. So that was all very exciting. But while that was going on, there were other things. I mean, we could get into a whole discussion about sexism in the movement. And I remember going to one GI conference, National GI Organizing Conference, when all the women went out for a caucus. And when they came back, they lined up in front of the conference, and they said, from now on, women are not doing all the cooking. We're not doing all the typing. We're not doing all the shit work. You guys are going to do equal, or we are all quitting the movement. It was a strike, a threat of a strike, and that was good, and that was, so there was a developing, there was the influence of the women's movement that was developing, and also the gay movement. I was very nervous about anybody identifying as gay in the organizing collective. I thought it would turn off the sailors. And one summer, during the Newport experience, I took a trip south. I just wanted to really see the deep south. So I was gone for a couple of weeks, traveling around, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and when I came back, everybody else had put out an issue of the paper that was all about gay liberation. And there was no backlash, and I learned my lesson. So it was political. And after the first year, the first year was all civilians. At the end of the first year, they all left. That they had done their year, and so we rebuilt the collective with active duty sailors, recent veterans, and women married to what they call dependents. I asked a woman one time, "What were you before you were a Navy dependent?" She says, "I was an independent." So, and then there was the black struggle, and that was something that had affected me, for a good while, because of the professors we had in school. One guy was, kicked out of his parish, and one priest in Los Angeles for helping Martin Luther King organize a civil rights march there. And he organized us to go to Roxbury in Boston and clean toilets in a Catholic school that had said that May Gadpile, a local community activist who is a bit of a nationalist, started a Montessori program for kids, for black kids, and the Catholic Church said they could use the basement so long as she cleaned out the bathrooms. So
Good.
So Father Elias had us go down on Saturdays and clean the bathroom, and that was, my first experience being in a black neighborhood, and and talking to some of the local folks. And then the first year of college in Niagara Falls, Ontario, they had us go to Buffalo and go door to door for the local parishes to do census work, which meant that this white kid from you know Boston had the opportunity to knock on hundreds of doors in the black community, be invited in and hear people's stories. You know, everything from, the elderly woman who, asked me to hear her confession and wouldn't take no for an answer and really wouldn't. I heard her confession. I had no right to do that, but she hadn't done anything bad. And then there was, the guy who had just come back from a stint in the military in Germany and said, when I was in Germany, people accepted me, as a fellow Catholic. And when I go to Catholic church here, they let me know right away that I'm black and not as accepted. And then there was the Muslim family, who had an entirely different perspective. And I was like, I was supposed to be there to see how the church could help people. And it was just, it was just a learning experience for me. And when I got to when I got out of the seminary and came back to Boston, my oldest sister was a student nurse, and she was volunteering on the weekends at the Black Panther Party free health clinic. So I was working as a hospital orderly part-time while I was in school. And I organized a group of student nurses to steal medical supplies for the clinic. It was a very small operation. I only got 2 bags of supplies. But one Friday night, I borrowed my mother's car. I didn't tell her where I was going. I was still living at home. I guess I was 19. And I drove to the Panther Party office, and I was scared to death because I'd never been it was a Friday night. I'd never been in Roxbury before. But I figured, the Panther Party would be safe. So I parked my car, and I didn't bother knocking. I was really scared. I just walked in. And they were having a meeting, and they didn't lock the door. And they're all sitting around in a circle. There's about 18, 20 people. And the door opens, and this white kid walks in with 2 bags, and everybody froze. And because they, what is it, a bomb? And I said, I brought you presents. And he said, what? He said, I have some supplies for the medical clinic. And they all started laughing, like, wow. So I gave them to him. And, by that time, a couple of people had blocked the door. And I said, so I'll try to get some more. And he said, okay, thank you. Okay. it was, and we wound up in Newport. We used to run trips for sailors up to Boston to visit movement centers. We visited Third World Newsreel and South End Press, and we go to the Panther Party office. And, and some, incredibly patient young black guy would sit down with these white kids from Ohio and explain to them about the black struggle. It was just terrific. And, that kind of personal contact, was really helpful in changing people's consciousness. So, I mean, I have a statue at home of a very young teenager who's obviously enslaved, but his fist is up and the chain is broken, and it's from Haiti. And we had a couple of we had a little group of sailors that we were doing a political study group, and we had just finished reading Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and they had visited Haiti. And when they went to Haiti, they passed the local office of the Bank of America, and a couple of young Haitians, homeless, were sleeping on the steps. And the image really affected them. And they found this statue in the local market. It was when Papa Doc was a dictator, and he used to like to play up the revolutionary past of Haiti to give himself sort of a progressive veneer while he was a horrible dictator. And they bought this statue and they brought it home. And so there's this consciousness, and from the beginning, I'm rambling a little bit, I know, but in the beginning in Newport, it was the anti-war movement and support for the black struggle. We were having before we opened up the coffee house, the bookstore, we had an organizing meeting one night, and someone came over and said, the cops just busted Ron Miller. Ron Miller was the head of the local Black Power organization, and their big thing was trying to get the police department to stop using this instrument called the claw, which was like one handcuff that went on your wrist, and they would twist it so it was painful, and that was a means to control people. It was, I don't know if it was unique to Newport, but it's the only place I ever heard of it happening. Anyway, Ron had gotten into an argument with some guy at a local bar, some white guy, and the white guy smashed his car window, and Ron went up to the police station to file a complaint. They wouldn't take the complaint. So he went back to the bar to confront the guy and got arrested. So we all went down to the local police station, and there was about half a dozen of us, all white, and there were about 30 young black kids there, teenagers, and they were really pissed. And they were yelling in front of the police station, "Free Ron Miller, free Ron Miller." And the cops came out, about 8 or 10 of them with shotguns. And they all ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. And I said, "I gotta get the hell out of here." And then I said, "Well, if you leave, you might as well leave Newport, because you'll never have any credibility." So we stayed all night. We stayed all night, and until Ron was charged, and there was some serious charges. And I remember at one point somebody went out for coffee, and they were asking, "Do you want coffee? How do you want coffee? How do you want coffee?" And this one guy says, "I want it black. I want it black with an afro." So we went to court. And I'm sitting in the back, and one of Ron's friends comes up and says, "If Ron gets convicted, we're going to blow up City Hall. Are you with us?" And I thought, if I say no, I lose my relationship with this organization. And I knew that we had to have a relationship with the black community in order to do any kind of political work. And I said, "Sure." And then I sat in the back of the courtroom saying, "Free Ron Miller, free Ron Miller. Oh, please, free Ron Miller." And he was acquitted. But things moved along. But
Do you find, here's my question that kind of like came up through your rambling of the talking about the time.
you can say rambling.
That are the people who you're reaching, the GIs that you're reaching, do they seem to be on the more educated side, or do they tend to be people who didn't have opportunities that are looking for more?
See, this is the big reason why I went to GI organizing, because I thought my job as a white person would be to reach white working class people. I mean, I had enough of a class consciousness to know that, it was the working class that was fighting the war. And the Navy was made up of a lot of people who didn't want to go to Vietnam. That's why you don't get drafted into the Navy, you're drafted into the Army. So these were people who joined the Navy to avoid being drafted into the Army and going to Vietnam. And if they went to Vietnam, they'd be on a ship.
Yeah,
it's
a little more removed than being
right.
on the ground.
Right. But then again, you had, the politics, and the politics overlapped with the culture. So the young white working class guys who smoked dope were anti-war, and the ones who were pro-war, they were the boozers. And that was, and the whites would get their dope from the black sailors who had connections in the community. And there was always, and the whites were very diverse. They were non-hierarchical. The blacks always had one leader. and they were organized. And so even if it was informal. So what we would do is we would develop relationships with the white sailors and teach them their rights, including, the illegal searches that were going on, um, and even how to bring complaints against the brass and so on, and how to get out if that was, what they wanted to do. And through them, we would meet the black sailors. And I remember that there was this one guy who was arrested for some act of defiance, and he was in a leadership position. And we went and visited him in the brig, and we brought him 20 books from the bookstore. He says, "What do you want me to do with these?" I said, "Read them." And that was it. And they were all, really great political books, and we established a relationship. And later, when I was passing out, sometime later, I was passing out the newspaper in front of the Navy Y, and two black guys came out. One of them said, "I don't want that shit." And the other one said, "No, that's all hands abandoned ship. They helped us when we were in the brig." So, these were all like lessons for me, you know. And that was interesting too, because the very first time we went down to pass out a leaflet, I had the leaflet, and here's these two or three white sailors, and I was going to walk up to them, and all of a sudden I realized I'm scared to death. I'm still that kid, but I got a job to do. I got a political job to do. I went up and handed them the paper. And, it was the movement that helped me get beyond, those types of neuroses and so on, to an extent.
Well, you
But,
moved to Rhode Island, but you knew that you're classified as 1A. So what's going on in that respect during this time?
well, after I went to work with the Boston Draft Resistance Group, I found out that you can request a meeting with your draft board to discuss your situation. So I did. And I just wanted to tell them off before I
This is
went.
after you'd seen the doctors.
After the whole process, I was just resigned to going to prison, and I thought I could handle it at that point.
You didn't think about going to Canada.
I'd been to Canada. No, I didn't want to feel like that I was letting the U.S. government drive me out of Canada. I didn't want I didn't want to give them the power to force me out of my own country, to say I was something that I wasn't, to say that I was a conscientious objector when I really wasn't. I was getting more defiant, you know. Yeah, I remember when someone in the SDS chapter had said, they read that the government was keeping files on 7 million people. And I said, gee, if we can get that up to about 50 million, it'll be useless. Get everybody on the list. So
So you met with your draft
I
board.
met with my draft board, and I was going to tell them off. But there was a complication. A week before I met with the draft board, I got into a fight with my old sister's boyfriend, who was really, we had come to understand he was completely abusing her. And she was also $10,000 in credit card debt, which today would be, I think I figured out one time, it's like 80,000. And I had gone over a couple of times to her house to confront him. And the third time I went, he was there, and I broke in the house, and we fought in the living room and down the hallway and out the front porch. And when he going out the front door, he pushed me against the door, and my elbow hit the broken glass, and I cut my ulnar nerve,
Oh.
so I can't salute. It's a 4F. So after.
So you got a medical, it was a medical.
I told off the draft board, yeah. I said, I got so self-righteous. I mean, it was just glorious. I had this long, wool overcoat, and I had long hair, and looked a little biblical prophet type. And I said, and someday you are going to stand on trial for your sins. And then I handed them the letter from the doctor. And the guy gave a big smirk. And so I got a 4F. And and at that point, I could have done anything.
So how old were you at that
I
point?
was 20.
You were 20.
Yeah,
And that's 1969.
69. So,
Did you, because the other thing I haven't really focused on this before, but I find fascinating because in 1971, it wouldn't have been as much a factor for you, but the voting rights bill that passes that lowers the voting age to 18 in 1971. That seems like a big kind of,
I dabbled in electoral politics. I went clean for Gene in '68. Gene, what was his name? He was a peace candidate,
uh-huh.
and I went to a couple of cities and knocked door to door, for him, and by the time McGovern ran, I realized he was bad on the Middle East. So it was just the Vietnam War he was against. Um, but it seemed like, and it was Nixon who was president when we get out of Vietnam. And that really convinced me it's always the mass movement. It's not who's in office. I mean, Biden, thank God we had Biden. We might have had Trump. He might have done terrible things. Well, Biden is protecting and funding Israel to carry out the most gross genocide in my lifetime. They've just resumed the bombing again today. They're killing children. They're killing whole families. This is the Democrats. So it's, I would never vote for a Democrat on the national level. State level, local, that's different. But once you get into foreign policy, they're all going to defend the empire. And that's what it is. I knew that the U.S. had 800 military bases in 70 countries. China has one. Russia has 8. But I didn't realize that the U.S. has 90% of all the overseas bases in the world. That's an empire. That is not a country operating in its own self-defense. That is a military defense of an economic empire. That's all it is. And well, anyway, I'm jumping. There's a couple of things that
But do you think allowing people to vote at a younger age gives them more power to decide what the direction?
Yeah, I think I think having the right to vote is extremely important. Whether it does any good depends on particular circumstances, but on the local level, it matters. Um,
But
it,
also, if you're being sent to defend your country, don't you think you should have the right to vote for?
you can't even buy a beer.
Yeah.
You can kill somebody and lose your life, but you can't buy a beer.
But prior to 1971, it was, a different age
Yeah,
to
yeah.
vote. So that was,
I think, yeah, younger people tend to be more progressive. Um, and that's not across the board, but I do think going to higher education, you're going to college, exposes you to more ideas, and that's a class privilege. So unfortunately, that means the working class is not as exposed to those progressive ideas as the middle class. And one of the things that leads to is the Democratic Party abandoning the working class. Um, so they get picked up by the right wing, which is where we're at today. But that's a whole other story. Um, I wanted to tell you about one experience that we had because I think you were kind of playing with the idea of, I thought you were going to say, do you think you're actually influencing anybody?
do you think you're actually influencing anybody?
Yeah. And you have to take a very holistic view of history. There's lots of different influences. So we're out there passing out a newspaper. It's got an anti-war message. Does that reach somebody? Well, it depends on their context. It depends what's happening. Up till '68, the general sentiment in the country was, we need to win this war. You need to stop the communists. '68 was the year of the Tet Offensive, when 108 cities went up in Vietnam, cities and towns. And although it was not militarily successful, it showed that the United States was not going to win the war. All the Vietnamese had to do was last one day longer than the U.S. They didn't have to beat the U.S., they just had to outlast it. And after '68, the soldiers realized this was a losing prospect. They weren't going. All they wanted to do was just get home in one piece, and and all the veterans, all the so-called right-wing veterans that I've talked to, almost none of them felt like their mission was to kill communists. Their mission was to get their brothers home. That's all it was. And if you say anything against their brothers, you're in trouble. But it wasn't, it wasn't so much of an ideological thing. It was some. There was certainly some. But after 68, the rank and file in the military realized this was a losing proposition. So why participate? Why bother? I had one friend. He was in the army, and he worked with us for a while. Um, and he said that when he was over there, um, it was understood that the Vietnamese were not shooting at black soldiers. Um, they would put up signs and say, brother, why are you fighting other people of color? How are you being treated at home, and so on. And so, and even I'm kind of throwing everything into the pot because there's so many stories. But one friend of mine that I worked on a welfare right, I shouldn't say we're friends. He was my security during a sit-in at the state capitol. I was the only white person involved, and I was one of the speakers, and they assigned security for me. And he said his nickname was Smoke, and I'm not sure how he got that, but because besides smoking, it also means, taking someone out. Anyway, and he was a big guy too. He said he was in Vietnam, and he was with two other guys, and they were in a firefight, and they were surrounded, and they ran out of ammunition, and they were all black. And one of them said, "I heard they don't shoot at brothers, and I'm gonna try something." And he stuck his fist up, and the shooting stopped, and they got up and they walked away. So my friend, who was white, he was very jealous about this. So he said that the white guys used to start to put a red bandana around their head, and that meant if you don't fire at me, I won't fire at you. So he would go out on patrol, and they would go out about 100 yards or so and sit down and smoke dope all day. And then they come back and they say, we didn't see anything. He even said that he had a local girlfriend too, and he said one time he was over at her, and she was living in what they call a hooch, just kind of a hut kind of thing, and they're having tea, and all of a sudden there was a noise outside, so he picked up his gun. He was going to go out. She said, "Don't let me go." And she went out. She came back in with this guy who's dressed in pajamas. He was NLF, what they call Viet Cong, which is a slur. It means Vietnamese commie. And he sat down, and they had tea, and he wanted to know about what the Panthers were doing, and the protests in Berkeley. And they spent the night like that. I mean, things, so things were changing. Now, the story I really wanted to tell you
Okay.
was we used to do some work with Vietnam veterans against the war. And these guys were incredible. I mean, they were mostly combat veterans in the Army. And they were real for, camaraderie. They'd been through a lot together. And they had done all these really good protests and throwing the medals back over. So they did a thing. All of this is, when I was in Newport. We haven't gone into anything about Norfolk.
Yeah, we gotta get there.
Okay, but yeah, the Virginia angle. So they were going to do a thing called the Winter Soldier Operation, and the old thing about summer soldiers are with you and that things are okay, but winter soldiers, those are the ones who stay through the hard times. Kind of thing came out of the Revolutionary War. So they went out to Lexington and Concord, and they had a action there. I think there were some arrests, and then they did a car caravan into Boston, and they were going to bivouac that night at Bunker Hill, and then they were going to march through Charlestown. So I said, oh, Jesus, if there's any group I would do this with, it's a VVAW, but I know Charleston. They beat you up just for having long hair in Charleston. What are they going to do if you march in there, anti-war? So we met the caravan, and I noticed that the police were stopping the traffic at red lights so that the caravan could go through. And I thought that was really interesting. I'd never seen that before. And they got up to Bunker Hill, and so we joined them, and we spent the night on Bunker Hill. And then the next morning, we got in formation to march into Charleston. And I'm going, okay, this is it. I got this far in my life. This is not a bad way to go out. And we're marching, and it was silent. and everybody's, all the guys are in their fatigues, and there's women, there's some women soldiers, some women vets, but, it's mostly men. But there were also, family members and relationships. And in the middle of it, this one group of like 10 soldiers were carrying this giant NLF flag. I mean, it must have been like 8 feet wide and 20 feet long. They're carrying it flat. And we get into Charleston, and Charleston is an area of, very narrow streets and maybe like two-story buildings. And we get further and further into Charleston, and we're marching, and, it wouldn't be easy to get out. And people are hanging out the windows, and they're lining the streets, and they're all just watching. It's all white, it's all white. And I'm going further and further and further, and then I see us coming up to this little intersection, and there's a little convenience store on the right-hand side. There's a bunch of young white guys in, white T-shirts with the marbles pulled up and slick back hair. They're staring at us, One guy ran into the store and comes out with this whole armful of sodas. And I go, oh shit, they're gonna bombard us, So he takes a soda and he throws it at the crowd underhand. And one of the vets reached up and caught it in the air and held it, and the whole street burst into applause. And from there on, it was just cheering. Their boys had come home and said the war was wrong. And if they said it, it must be right. And that's when I knew we were going to win. That was it. They had broken through. They reached the white working class. The black working class was already, supporting popular songs, War, Who Needs It? What's it good for? Absolutely nothing. The Panthers had run a 2-page spread in their newspaper with all their members who had been in the military in uniform saying, you don't want to fight, this war. But when they lost the white working class, that's when, and some of these young guys became very, very political, and some of them formed, some of them joined leftist revolutionary organizations. It was really a heady time, and of course in the military itself there was a breakdown of discipline, and there was an attack on officers, and I think it was in 1 year after Tet there were something like 263 documented instances of fragging, of attacks on officers. First they take a grenade pin and put it on a green lieutenant's cot, and that was, don't send this out anymore. And if you didn't heed that, the next time it would be a grenade. So, it was a big reason for why the military had to pull out, was the resistance within the military. And of course the first thing was, the Vietnamese people. So all of these things were churning at the same time. This class.
You did the parade in Charleston. What year was that? Like, in what time of year was that?
Geez, I wish I could remember, but I'll bet it was 69 or. No, wait a minute. No, I can pin it down more than that, because we started the Potemkin bookstore. Potemkin, named after the revolutionary ship in the 1905 revolution in Russia that mutinied and joined the revolution. And which the local newspaper pointed out wandered the seas for 2 years and then finally dissolved or captured or something. But we only lasted 2 years, but still. It must have been 70, probably right around 70. Yeah, could have been 70, 71.
So was that kind of around the time that they had the Winter Soldier congressional?
Yeah, it was right around that time. And John Kerry was, I remember the VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, was trying to decide who was going to represent them in the congressional hearing. And there was an argument over, should it be a working class rank and file soldier, or should it be John Kerry, who was an officer and more educated, and he won out. And I thought that was really a bad sign. And it turned out to be. When he finally ran for president, he rowed a boat across Boston Harbor into a press conference and said, so-and-so John Kerry reporting for duty. I said, well, you're not against the war in Vietnam anymore? What now you're running for, what are you, Tim Kaine? So, poor Tim Kaine is supporting all kinds of bad things now. So, I mean, that was an example of how the developments in the war itself were affecting the general population, and particularly the GIs, and how the agitation and organized groups that were reaching out and trying to spread consciousness and setting up organizing activities was accelerating the development of that political consciousness, and all of which kind of culminated in a situation in which the U.S. felt it had to cut its losses. The U.S. government had to cut its losses because they're not only did they have the anti-war movement, they had the Black liberation struggle, and they were both going on at the same time, and they had to find a way to pacify both, you know, and along with repression, you know, when Ehrlichman and Nixon came up with the idea of demonizing marijuana so they could, you know, arrest, you know, anti-war activists, and was it cocaine or heroin? Crack? I forget which one it was. Was it cocaine? You know, so they could, you know, crack down on the Black community. But along also with, you know, the anti-poverty programs, you know, which were necessary, but which also, you know, bought up a couple of, you know, some activists. Similar to today, where there is almost no independent multi-issue activism because everybody works for a nonprofit. It's been the death of the anti-war movement, which is another whole subject. So, okay, well, I mean, I think that kind of gives you an idea of how these different issues of class, race, and gender, and the anti-war issues.
How do you feel about the press and what they're doing and how they're reporting the war?
The press?
Yeah. How do you feel like that is affecting the anti-war movement? Because we interviewed a lot of soldiers who felt like the press was against them.
Well, during the Vietnam War, there was a vibrant media industry. It wasn't controlled by a small number of monopolies. And you had reporters who were going to Vietnam that were not embedded in military units. Some of them were quite courageous, you know, in going out and getting stories. And then people like, you know, Seymour Hersh, who exposed the My Lai massacre, and later Abu Ghraib. Today, there are about a half a dozen major media conglomerates. And when I listen to NPR, which I do, I mean, that's really the only station I listen to, on domestic issues, they can be quite good, and they can expose a lot of injustices. On international issues, it's the State Department line, straight down the line. They have to give, you know, some coverage of Gaza because it's such it's so grotesque. But on other issues, and you know, since I've been in Richmond, you know, we got deeply involved in the issue of Iran. You know, I've been there twice. I wrote a book about it. You know, we had multiple, you know, lots and lots of contacts, and really delved into it. At one point, I really thought we knew more about what was going on in Iran than the State Department, especially when I read stuff that they put out. And you know, it was lies. It was just all lies. And Ukraine, the same thing. I've been working on Ukraine since 2016. I went there, you know, as an international observer for a memorial to mark the murders of 42 people who were killed by fascists a few months after the 2014 coup. And I know that Ukraine is not a democratic country, you know, and there's a very strong fascist movement, and that it was used by the U.S. And NATO, as you know, to provoke Russia. And this war is only meant to weaken Russia, and the U.S. will continue it as long as it can continue to pour money into it. And practically everything we've been told about it is a lie. But you turn on NPR, and all you get is stories sympathetic to. You never hear a real presentation of the Russian side. Now, just from a point of view of journalism, aren't you supposed to? I mean, are you supposed to pick a side? Is that the role of journalism? I mean, we do in our newspaper because we're an unabashedly advocacy paper, and we don't feel like we have to present both sides because one side is all that everybody is getting, presenting another side. But we don't lie, you know, we don't cover up for people. But what's being put out in mass media today about Iran, about there's very, most people think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict started on October 7th. They don't know that, that Israeli settlers have been rampaging in the West Bank, for the better part of the last year, killing people and burning crops and destroying livestock and desecrating mosques and that there are thousands and thousands of Palestinians in Israeli prisons, many of them who have never been charged with a crime, a large number of who are children. Um, and that's what, led to October 7th. However you feel about it, it was not unprovoked. And the Russian intervention in Ukraine was not unprovoked. You can argue about it, whether it was right or wrong, a, a whether it was the right or wrong thing to do, but you can't argue that it was unprovoked. And yet you don't get that from the mass media. So the media played a very strong role during the Vietnam era in exposing, but now Seymour Hersh has written extensively about how he believes the U.S. was behind the bombing of Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and he can't get any mainstream coverage of it. Now, this is not some fringe extremist, conspiracy theorist. This is the guy who has been one of the most respected U.S. journalists for 40 years, and he can't get any attention on his well documented, expose. So today, the anti-war movement is at a phenomenal. It's at the lowest point that I think you could say since the early 60s, very early 60s. And it's a combination of things. It's a combination of the consolidation of the news media. It's the fact that so many young activists are now working for nonprofits, which are funded by liberal foundations, which are tied to or sympathetic with the Democratic Party, and they are not going to allow you to criticize anything. We just carried out a all-day public hearing on Virginia's prisons, jails, and detention centers. We had it at the Greater Richmond Convention Center. There was no coverage by any news media except for Radio IQ, which I found. And a friend of ours who works for the Times Dispatch told us that was a political decision, not an editorial decision. We had endorsements from 60 organizations. 20 of them are groups that work on prison justice. Every one of them is a nonprofit. There were no independent, volunteer, activist organizations like the Defenders, like the Potemkin Collective, like the movement used to be in the old days, where they knew that everything was connected. We didn't have to wait for some college kid to come up with the word intersectionality to know that class, race, and gender and anti-war issues are all part of the same deal. And you have to, address them all. Sorry, I don't mean to sound a college kid, but I really didn't like the word intersectionality. It says, because people thought they invented the concept along with the word. That's what I was upset about. There have been people doing this work before. It was kind of like when we discovered there were activists from the 30s. What? There was a movement in the 30s? I thought we invented activism, but no.
How did you go from Rhode Island to Virginia? I assume you went from Rhode Island to Virginia.
Everybody left. And we would have had to rebuild the group for the second time. And meanwhile, Norfolk was the largest military center on the East Coast that did not have an organizing project. And I felt that we had gotten our feet wet, we had grown. I didn't even tell you how we almost got arrested.
Okay. How did you almost get arrested?
We were open a couple of months when we got a phone call
In Norfolk?
in Newport.
Oh, in Newport.
Anonymous phone call saying that the police were going to raid the bookstore and find dope in the basement, and they were going to be arrested for selling hard drugs. We would have gone about 15 years at that time. We already had a little problem because the principal of the middle school across the street told the students not to go to the Potemkin bookstore because they showed pornographic movies and gave out dope. So we had this influx of kids that we had to deal with, and the Navy wives started a candle making program. And we would also make a black fist on their hands if they brought us a note from their mother saying it was okay. And then we got another phone call from someone who said they worked in the police department and they couldn't give us their name, but there was going to be a raid. Then a friend of ours came in and said that he overheard some cops talking about it. And then we got a call from a waitress in a restaurant who said she heard two cops talking about it. So we wrote a letter to the chief of police, and we're saying we understand that you're planning to do a raid on the Potemkin for selling hard drugs. Everyone knows that we don't allow drugs, and so this would only be a frame up. And so we want you to know that we're aware of this, and we're sending copies of this letter to the Newport Daily News, the Providence Journal, the Associated Press, the NAACP, the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and then we gathered up our contacts, written contacts, and the little money from the bookstore. We left town for 3 days, and nothing happened. But we did hear that the chief of police was wondering why the stationery was written on Salve Regina College letterhead. That was a local Catholic school. They called it Savior Regina. But they, but it was because it was the only letterhead we had. So yeah, we beat that one.
Pretty smart.
I thought it was for a 20-year-old. We were probably 21 by that point. Um, so
So in 1972, the bookstore.
the book,
ended.
everybody had left. So the question was, do we start it over again, or do we go to Norfolk? And uh, so
Would your funders, the people who supported you, fund in
no,
Norfolk? Or no, so there.
no, that was their their thing. That was great. And we were in. They were really wonderful, and we worked with them, and we figured we needed some middle class liberals to be around us as sort of protection. So we formed a group called the Newport Area Support to Ensure Everybody's Safety, the Nasties. Um, that was, and we had to form a corporation for the bookstore. So we went up. We had a friend, Peter Toms, a lawyer, and everybody else thought the president of the corporation would be arrested first. So they refused to be president. So at 20 years old, I was the president of a corporation. And I said yesterday we called it the Seabreeze Corporation because that was sort of, very neutral and so on, and like wouldn't attract government attention, because we had to file these papers. Turned out there was a Seabreeze Corporation. So we called it the Seabreeze 99 Corporation. And I explained that if we did get arrested, it would be the trial of the Seabreeze 99 and would immediately get a lot of attention because it was such a big trial. So, get it? All right, so then it was Newport, and there was a couple, young Navy vet, and his wife, who had moved to Norfolk and wanted to start a bookstore called the Crazy Horse Bookstore. And they asked us for help.
And this is 1972.
This would have been 72, yeah, around then. Maybe it could have even been 71. And so we gave them a list of books and that we carried and the book providers and some funding sources and we helped them get started. So we had contacts there. So I moved to Norfolk and gradually found some other folks, and there was a big case going on at the time. There was a sailor named Jeffrey Allison who was accused of setting a fire on his aircraft carrier. And so we formed a defense committee, the Jeffrey Allison Defense Committee, and we worked with his attorneys and had some public events and fundraising for his legal defense. And he was innocent. He was innocent. But it was a very small fire. And after it was over, we decided to keep the group together as just called the Defense Committee. Probably should have been the Defense Committee for Sailor Rights or something, but we just called it the Defense Committee. And we started a newspaper, and that was, we wanted to come up with a name that was radical, but also grounded in U.S. tradition. So we called it the Grapes of Wrath. And the white sailors called it the Grapes, and the black sailors called it the Wrath. And that was on a higher level than All Hands Abandoned Ship. Again, it was a monthly, probably about 8,000 copies, but we developed a really good system of mailing the paper onto ships, and people would take it and distribute it. So, and we also linked up with other organizing groups on the East Coast. There was one little group up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. There was Charleston, South Carolina. They had a paper called Fat Albert's Death Ship Times. There was the paper at Fayetteville, Fort Bragg, called Bragg Briefs. There was a paper at Camp Lejeune. I forget what that one was called. And we started meeting once a month in Jacksonville. And the Charleston group adopted the Grapes as his paper, and Portsmouth did. Bragg wanted to keep their own. They had a longer tradition. So the paper, but we were able, actually, at the height, we were able to reach 10% of the U.S. military with the paper.
Did people subscribe to it, or was it freely available to them?
The paper was free. We carried advertising. And we had some advertising. And then a friend of ours told us that the American Friends Service Committee was hiring field organizers. So I went down to Charleston, to Chapel Hill, and applied for the job, and got it. And then it was $15,000 a year. So we split the money between the Defenders and a black organization called the Tidewater Africans, whose founder I've been friends with for 50 years. He just passed last month. I went out to his funeral.
What was his name?
His name was Anthony Lewis, a tremendous activist. Played a really strong role in solidarity work with liberation struggles in Africa, particularly Zimbabwe, and was really well respected in the movement here and in Africa. So we gave half the money to them, and we used the other 7,500 to put out the newspaper. I don't know how the American Friends Service Committee felt about that, but it worked. And that project lasted 2.5 years, and we did a lot of really interesting work around Puerto Rico, around the Middle East. Had a statement about the Middle East that was read on the floor of Congress by J. William Fulbright. The only time we got arrested for that work was in Jacksonville, which wasn't exactly an arrest. It was more like a capture. There were 4 of us who were petitioning against the U.S. intervention in the Middle East. And one was a soldier, one was a sailor, one was an airman. And the military police came up and arrested the 3 of them. I was a civilian. And they didn't arrest me. So the rest of us went down to the police station to get them out. And while I was taking a picture of the 3 arrested guys in the back of the military van, they hauled us into the station as well. I had to call up a friend of ours who was a Navy lawyer, JAG officer. He made a phone call down and got us all released. And he said, "Phil, what are you doing in North Carolina? Just stay here in Norfolk where you belong." I thought that was really funny. But he used to call us up to get advice on conscientious objector claims because we knew more about the procedure. Because they didn't teach that in the Navy. I wrote the first book on military law for the GI movement. It was a little small red book. It was called The Little Red Book of Military Law, and it had a star on it. It was supposed to look like Mao's little red book. And it was very helpful. It was also fit in your back pocket, which is why Mao had his book that size.
Yeah.
And we had it printed at this South End Press in Boston, and we gave out hundreds and hundreds of copies. We had a little publication in Newport called Radical Words, or You Can't Tell the Revolution Without a Dictionary. It talked about class and race and collective and revolution and stuff, all. And Walter Collins with the Southern Christian Educational Fund wanted to buy 3,000 copies to distribute throughout the South in their organizing work. But his group had some connection with the Communist Party, and they objected to the fact that we were a little critical of the Soviet Union for not being the highest form of socialism. So we lost that. But
So what did the removal or the drawdown of troops and then the eventual departure of U.S. troops in 1973,
what a good segue.
how did that affect your efforts and what your focus was?
The movement changed. The movement changed. Like I said, because of the draft, that was the main reason why so many young people were concerned about Vietnam. And of course, there was a lot of idealism, and then, a certain section identified with the Vietnamese Revolution. But once the draft was over and then the war ended, the movement, dissipated. So it was, it was time to think about what else to do. And some other things were happening at the same time. Jimmy Carter came in and he was supposed to be, someone who understood the concerns of people and this, that, and the other. And then, he got more conservative towards the end of his administration, and then Reagan came in. Well, around the same time, there were some fundamental things happening with the economy. There was really a revolution in manufacturing, where things were changing and fewer workers were needed. So in the steel industry, it was the development of the mini mills that were smaller, deconcentrated. In coal mining, it was development of long mining, which was long machines that would do the work that individual miners would do. In the auto industry, it was robotics. And then there was, the moving of manufacturing to countries with lower, cheaper labor. And the movement from the North, unionized North, to the non-union South. So it became more difficult for people to just get out of high school and go into a job that would allow them a middle-class lifestyle. Heroin was, was flowing into the country during the Vietnam War, in part because of the CIA role in heroin traffic. That's been documented, the Golden Triangle and the role of Air America and Chiang Kai-shek's wife. I don't have to go into all of that. I mean, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but this stuff has been, really investigated and validated. And then later, during the Central America wars, it was cocaine, the Contras and the influx of. So anyway, you had the deindustrialization of the economy. You had the influx of drugs, and you had all these guys coming back from Vietnam with problems. I mean, 58,000 were dead. A lot of other people came back with physical injuries. A lot of people came back with PTSD, which was not understood at the time. It wasn't understood, certainly after World War II. But it took a long time to get recognition for that for Vietnam. So things, and there was a backlash to the progressive, gains in the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the general anti-war consciousness. And in the Reagan years, with the beginning of 1980, everything was a defensive fight. Instead of fighting to gain things, you were fighting to keep things. And the only real struggles, mass struggles that developed were around apartheid in South Africa and the AIDS crisis. But since then, it's been really difficult. So, I mean, I had to make a decision about what I was going to do. And at that point, I had decided that, capitalism was the problem, socialism was the answer, and I needed to get myself into some kind of an organization. So I joined a group called Workers' World that was a Marxist organization, Marxist-Leninist. And I was in it for 29 years, and got to the level of the administrative committee, which was the national leadership body. And then I left in 2004. After the original founders died, the next layer of leadership I felt had less of a gut understanding of the black community and a commitment on other than, it began to see the black community as the other, as outside the party. The party was multiracial, but predominantly white. And if you didn't join the party, then it showed that you weren't as political. So everybody in the black community was less political than anybody in workers' world. And they began to do some things which I really felt uncomfortable with, and then finally felt I didn't want them to represent me to the black community. By that time, I had moved to Norfolk. I mean, from Norfolk, I moved to New York. I was there for 12 years, working with Workers' World, mainly on national organizing and a lot of labor work. And I was also the party songwriter. And we had a little group, and we performed, in the movement and for labor struggles, and so on. I
Have you
visited
been musical your whole life, or
since I was 14. Yeah.
did you prefer to sing, or did you play an instrument?
I sang, but I hold my notes too long, and it's obvious. So I'm trying to work on that. But I used to sing with a woman named Naomi Cohen, and I wrote 3 songs for Palestine, and the Palestinian group, General Union of Palestinian Students, used to bring us around to perform at their events. She's Jewish, and it helped to show that they weren't anti-Jewish; they were anti-Zionist. And in the time in Workers' World, it was really, I was in the party because it provided me a structure in which to carry out the work I wanted to do. So, I was able to intervene in the piston coal strike in Southwest Virginia. Wrote a book about that, but we were there, during some really heavy times and developed really strong relationships with the miners. The International Paper Workers strike, and I wrote the strike song that was adopted by the union. The Newport News strike, organizing strike of '79, which I also wrote the union strike song that's in a movie, a documentary. And got to, and through the music, develop relationships with, various communities of color that I probably would have a much more difficult time doing on my own. And that was good. And that was good. But then, it was time to go.
How long were you in Norfolk before you
9
went to New
years.
York?
9 years.
9 years.
2.5 years in Newport, 9 years in Norfolk, 12 years in New York, 7 years in Milwaukee, and then since 2000 here in Richmond.
So you were with the
Workers' World.
Workers' World, and you say that to 2004. So when you moved back to Richmond, you were still working with them.
Right.
But in all of those moves, it was all in the capacity of that, working for that group for people.
Well, working for them, it was all volunteer. But, we had different committees and worked on those. Because I was part of the labor caucus. And like I said, the cultural work was really important. We used to perform with the singing group of the African National Congress. They were called the Shashava Singers. And every time their group in New York wanted to go back for a conference in South Africa, they would have a concert, and we would split the bill with them. We had several songs on South Africa. I remember one time, my wife gets a kick out of this. One of the Shashava singers, a woman, told me that she says, "Phil, someday when the history of the struggle in South Africa is written, your songs will be a footnote." Well, okay, so I got that anyway. That was funny.
So
But
how are you supporting yourself along with your volunteer work
as a worker,
as a worker?
yeah, when I was really young, I wanted to get as many jobs as I could. I heard that Che did this on his motorcycle trip. Turned out not to be true. But I wanted to work as many different working class jobs as I could so I would really understand how people's lives were. So I worked in an industrial laundry. I was a hospital orderly. I drove cab. I worked in factories, construction work. Um, I used to freelance for different newspapers, mainly black newspapers. And uh, I worked for a little while for a print shop in uh, Milwaukee, but I got fired for yelling "fuck you, fuck you, fuck you" about 15 times at the second in command of the shop after he made a really disgusting remark about black women. So that didn't work. I worked in the print shop at Norfolk General Hospital till I got fired for calling the second in command an asshole after he just said something really racist. When we got back at him, writing a series of stories in the Newport, in the Norfolk New Journal and Guide exposing racism in the hospital. Um, that was fun. It was an 8-part series. Really shook up the hospital. Um,
It's a lot of stuff, to talk about, like 8 parts.
yeah,
It's not a little.
and they used to have the top leadership meet every day the paper came out to discuss it, how to respond to it. So yeah, that was an exciting time. Um, but in Norfolk, I really wanted to get into printing, and even got a printing press, but I didn't know how to. I was totally beyond me. I'm not mechanically inclined, but I really wanted to be a printer. And my mother's father was a typesetter. My uncle Bill was a foreman of the print shop for the Cape Cod Times, and also the union president, local president. Um, and so it was kind of, we got ink in our blood. So I went to work for a company called Teagle and Little in Norfolk and trained on a small press. Um, and that I did that work for 13 years in Norfolk and then in New York City when I moved to New York. But then in New York, I wound up running the in-house print shop for Billboard Publications, that publishes Billboard magazine. Um, Now it's called BPI Inc. And then they got sold out to another company. But yeah, I was in a corporate environment, running in it, doing all the stationery for all of these people, and that was an exciting time. That was '80s. I was making good money. I was in New York City. I was young. Um, it was we had holiday parties at Club 57, and the top of the Times magazine building and cruises around the state. There was a lot of flash, um, and that was cool. And also I had talked my way into the job, so by the time I got on top of it, I could finish the work in 4 or 5 hours, and I'd stay the rest of the day and do party work. I even got to show a slideshow at work about my trip to Cuba. Yeah,
I
we
bet
built.
people were really interested.
They really were,
Curiosity.
and it was kind of cool too because I was going out to lunch. One day, and I was outside the building. We worked in Times Square, and of course, there's a lot of tourists around. So somebody came up and said, it was this really pretty young woman who was taking pictures around, and I caught her eye, and she went, looked away. And then one of my friends came up and said, "Boy, that was really a great travel log you did about the Caribbean. Are you going to be making any more movies?" So that was kind of fun. But yeah, I got to show it in at work. And the piston and the pit. We did a slideshow on the piston strike. Got to show there, so we got away with a lot, and that was good. That was a good time. But yeah, I worked as a printer, and then when I moved to Milwaukee, that was for personal reasons. I was in a relationship. The woman had moved to Milwaukee, and so I moved out there to be with her. And it was kind of time to get out of New York. Um, the New York can trick you into thinking that's the center of the universe and that there's no life outside of New York, and that's not a healthy thing. Um, so yeah, and the final thing that got me convinced to move was when I went to the movies and I had to wait 45 minutes in line for just a regular old movie. And when I got in there, the lobby was incredibly crowded, and the usher got up halfway up a flight of stairs and got a bullhorn and said, "All you people going into the movie, stand over there. And all you people coming out, take out that door." And I thought, I could be in Jersey watching this on video. I don't need this. So I moved to Milwaukee, and thought I was going to set up a print shop. And I bought a press, and I bought a plate maker, and I had supplies, and it never got off the ground. I did. I'm a horrible business person. Um, I was a pretty good printer, but I wasn't. That was beyond it. And besides, it was just the time that desktop publishing was coming in, and and copy shops, and so it was wiping out all the work that I did. So I delivered newspapers for a couple of years, several weeklies, which was interesting because I got to know the entire city, and I wrote for the alternative newspaper, um, and and uh, and I had a pension from work, and I gradually worked my way through that. And then after 7 years, the relationship had broken up, but we had taken in a little girl, and we adopted. Well, my ex adopted her, but I couldn't because we weren't married. But she has my name, and so my ex wanted to move, and decided to move to Richmond. So I moved out to be with my daughter, um, and that's how I wound up here. And so I lucked out and got a job with the Richmond Free Press, and was there 2.5 years, and then left and started the Richmond Defender newspaper, which is now the Virginia Defender. And that was in 2002 that we started the organization. And that's been, 22, almost 22 years of an all volunteer, predominantly black, predominantly women organization that has an election for a 3-person steering committee every year. And that, I think, was putting into practice some of the ideas I had coming out of Workers' World, that was a better way to structure a left organization. Although the Defenders is, it doesn't define it. It's a community group, and people have different levels of political awareness, consciousness, and we have people active in the Democratic Party and in the churches, and that's fine, and Rastafarians and Muslims and Christians and atheists and a couple of communists and at various times anarchists, um, but agreeing to a certain basic set of principles that we're a working class organization that promotes the right of self-determination for oppressed peoples. That's kept us together. And we're known for, our work on Shop a Bottom, which has been transformative for the city. Always working on prison issues, always involved in the anti-war movement. Got heavily involved in Iran works in 2007, traveled the country, 10 days by van, wrote a book, invited back to attend an international conference later. I got to spend a week on my own um, in Tehran. If you're from this country, if you're from any other country, you can just go. But if you're from the U.S., you have to go as in contract with a government-approved travel agency, which doesn't mean it's a government agency. And we had a wonderful experience on our first trip. Um, the second time I went to the conference and then asked to stay another week, so I was just on my own, and that was really interesting. Um, so and then I wrote the book In Defense of Iran, Notes from a U.S. People's Delegation through the Islamic Republic, um, and did a lot of work around Iran, particularly at a time when the State Department was intervening indirectly into the anti-war movement, trying to set the principle that you had to condemn the government of Iran, or you shouldn't be in the anti-war movement. And we were able to turn back um, uh, uh, that attack. And then attending an international conference, anti-war conference in Poland, representing the United National Anti-War Coalition that we worked with from 2010 until 2018. I was asked to represent the group at this international conference, and we met people from Odessa, Ukraine, and heard about the massacre at the House of Trade Unions that took place a few months after the 2014 coup, when a huge fascist-led mob set fire to the building and murdered 42 people who were against the coup. Um, and they were having a memorial, and the same fascists were threatening to come back and attack the memorial. And one group had applied for a permit to run workshops for its youth group in the use of pyrotechnics and machine guns. Same time, same place as the memorial. So they were asked people to come over as international observers. And we did a whole campaign to try to get the attention of the U.S. State Department that there would be people from this country at the memorial, and that was successful. And the day came off well. I think we helped. Can't ever prove these things, but 4,000 people came out for the memorial, and only a few hundred of the fascists. So I know there was an Azov battalion. I know there was a right sector. I know there are people who emulate Hitler and that they have been incorporated into Ukrainian military and had been attacking the people in Donbass for years and years before the Russian intervention. So, we've written extensively about this, and I'm starting to work on a book, a Ukraine primer. So the anti-war, work has continued, but the movement as a whole, although there are organizations, and there was just this huge march of several 100,000 people in D.C. about Gaza, and so it shows that there are still organizations that have some capacity to organize. But the combination of the end of the Vietnam War, the Obama years were really detrimental for the anti-war movement. And for a couple of reasons. He was first projected as a peace candidate, and he won the primary in Iowa on that basis. And it was only after that, after he won in this predominantly white state, that he began to attract attention from the black community. And then once he was elected, of course, everybody who had any kind of a consciousness was worried that he was going to be assassinated. And also he was being attacked every single day. So the black community in particular, and much of the white progressive movement, were very reluctant to criticize him on anything, which is understandable. The problem was it gave him a blank check on foreign policy issues. And so you had the specter of a black president authorizing the destruction of the most economically developed country in Africa, which was Libya, which is now a failed state and a haven for right-wing extremists who have spread throughout Western Africa and have destabilized Mali and Burkina Faso and Chad and so on. And we follow this to the extent that my wife, Anna Edwards, was the president and now the vice president of Virginia Friends of Mali, and has been to Mali several times, 3 times, and knows the internal situation very well, and knows what effect that destruction of Libya had. So the Obama years, just to be more specific, the largest anti-war coalition was called United for Peace and Justice. They had 5 full-time staff members. When Obama began to pick up momentum, donations began to go to him and not to the peace movement, and all 5 resigned because they weren't being paid. And the organization folded. And United National Anti-War Coalition was all volunteer, so that continued. But it was, the Obama years, the reduction of financial donations, the rise of the nonprofit complex, which has sucked up so many activists. All of those things have led to a real, and the consolidation of the media has led to a real lack of consciousness among progressives about what's going on around the world. And it's only really the incredible destruction in Gaza that has woken some people up, a lot of people up to the fact that the U.S. is backing the wrong side in this conflict, and is funding it, is refusing to call for a ceasefire, has blocked motions in the UN Security Council for a ceasefire, and is as responsible for the destruction in Gaza as is Israel. And this is the Democratic Party. This is the one that so many so-called progressives have put their hopes on. So we're in a very, very, very difficult situation. And Biden's position on Gaza uh, may well cost the Democrats the presidency. And it could be Trump or someone just as bad. And if Trump gets in, I'm afraid we're into a much worse situation where he is really flirting with classical fascism. And I think we're going to see uh, mass mobilizations of groups like the Proud Boys and others on our streets, forbidding anyone to have a progressive event. This happened during the Boston busing crisis in '74, where the South Boston Marshals was a paramilitary group that developed in the anti-busing movement. And they went around and drove people off the streets for unrelated issues. And it became a real problem until there was a mass march organized by Workers' World Party that changed the atmosphere in the city. That's when I joined. That kind of won me over. So today we're in a very interesting but complex situation where the economy appears to be doing okay, but it's a house of cards. And everybody seems to really understand that it could collapse at any moment based on international issues, based on other economies, um, and based on consumer preferences. I understand people are now pulling back from buying, which was what was keeping us out of a recession all during this period of the inflation, the interest rate hikes. So there's that. So you always have to look at what's going on economically to see what the foundation is looking like. And then you've got the country split down the middle between an increasingly hardline right wing and a progressive liberal group that is dominated by white middle class people in the Democratic Party who are afraid of and don't respect the working class, whether it's white or black or any other race, and has thoroughly alienated white working class people who could have been won over. So that there are whole sections in places like Kentucky that voted for Obama in 2008 and Trump in 2016, 16, whatever the next one was. Yeah, just flipped on economic issues, not necessarily on racial issues. Um, which is not to say that there's a whole section of the white working class that is now hopeless, um, but not the majority. And we've tried in a lot of ways to reach out. When there was the big gun rights rally at Capitol Square, 20,000 people coming out with guns. Um, uh, Joseph and I spent the day at the rally, walking around, talking to people, taking the temperature. And I had issued an open letter to gun right advocates, calling on them, saying that we respect, your right to own, a weapon for self-defense. That's the constitutional right. We agree with that. I've been a gun owner all my life. But you have to expel these white supremacists from your movement. Number one, because it's right, and number two, because you're alienating all those people in the black community who also feel they have a right to have a gun in the house for self-protection. So, we're still trying. You know, um, we're trying to operate as an ally of the black community while reaching out to white workers on an economic basis, but challenging them. Not saying we're going to forget the divisive issues, but challenging them on the issue of racism, because that's the only way to build a real coalition. If you ignore, there was a black Marxist sociology professor in Tuskegee in the 1940s, and he had the formulation that class is primary, but race is not secondary. I call him a Zen Marxist. And that was, I thought, was a brilliant expression, because that's been the shoal upon which popular movements have crashed um, over the years. Labor movements was felt you can't talk about racism and sexism because that turns off the backward workers we want to keep in the union, or national liberation movements that said there's no possibility of uniting on a class basis because there's only a national liberation struggle, which is the right of oppressed people to take that position. But strategically, it's unlikely to work in a country that's 63% white, which is why we like Gabriel, because Gabriel was black and a worker. He was a blacksmith, and he built a movement that was against the merchants, as he called them, the merchant class, to end slavery. So this was a national liberation struggle, a black-led national liberation struggle that also had a class perspective and recruited white workers and indigenous people and any other group that could be brought in. But it was a black-led national liberation struggle that had a class perspective. He understood the intersection, and few others do, and few others have in the course of the U.S. movement. You go back to the Knights of Labor and the populist movement and the struggles of the unions and so on. And so let's end on a positive note. There are positive, if you want to add, there are positive things that are going on. The upsurge in the labor movement is extremely important. And I noticed that Sean Fain,
The automotive.
president of the automotive union, who's very feisty, gave a press conference wearing a T-shirt that said "Eat the Rich," and got noticed for that. But one of the auto executives said, you got to be careful because, you ask too much of the auto companies, and these foreign auto workers are going to undercut the wages, and they're the ones that are going to get the jobs. And Sean said, don't you be attacking and scapegoating foreign workers, because those are our future UAW members. And I thought, wow, this guy is good. This guy gets something. And if there are labor leaders that, the labor movement is still overwhelmingly run by white men or increasingly white women. But so, you get twice as many white people to oppress you. So, which is the big results of affirmative action in this country. I always argue that the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action are white men, because they're married to white women. So when white women make more money, they make more money. And then who's the biggest direct beneficiary is white women. So anyway, so there's that. There's the fact that younger people tend to be more progressive. And, that the younger Democrats are the most opposed to Biden's policy in terms of Israel. I think, although I've never been that involved in the environmental struggle, because I thought, for two reasons, I thought there were enough people keeping an eye on it, but also I think it was meant to be a distraction for white activists, young white activists, to get them out of the anti-war movement, to get them out of connections with the black community. And so when Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, Senator Gaylord Nelson, but Gaylord Nelson, come on. Yeah. He started Earth Day in 1970? And Earth Day is London's birthday, which I think he picked on purpose. And that was really meant to draw youth, like the same effect that Woodstock had, to draw youth out of the cities, out of the struggle, away from contact with black people, away from looking to groups like the Panther Party for leadership. So I never paid that much attention to it, but I think the environmental crisis is what is finally going to move people. And my perspective at this point is that it's going to create such social chaos that the only response that the government will be able to have is an ironclad clapdown, and that we're going to go through a period of authoritarian dictatorship. I think that's not necessarily going to happen, just like environmental disaster is not necessarily going to happen, but I think it's the trajectory, and that a lot of people are going to suffer until we're able to reconstitute. And we'll reconstitute because life wants to live. That's the prime directive. When what was that volcano up in Washington that spewed years ago, and they said nothing would grow there for.
Not St. Helens.
Was it Sentinel?
Yeah.
No, they said nothing would grow there for 100 years, and the next spring, there was a resurgence of vegetation. Life wants to live, and people are going to the human species will figure out a way to survive. But I think we're going to go through a very difficult time, and that our job at this point is to try to do everything we can to sound the alarm, and particularly to counter the notion that progressives should not be prepared to physically defend themselves. I think that's a prescription for disaster. And you just have to study the Weimar Republic in World War II and see, and what's happened in other places. And I think and we have tried to raise this and have frankly gotten almost no response. And the few examples of people, addressing that issue seem to be self-promoters just looking for publicity. I don't see anything, fundamentally developing. So where does that leave us for the next presidential election? Could you possibly vote for Biden after Gaza? But do you want Trump? I don't think I think it's a choice between cancer and a heart attack. Which way do you want to die? And I refuse to make that choice. If you're going to kill me, but I'm not participating in the process. So we'll continue to put out the newspaper, continue to try to educate people, show the relations between the labor struggle, the community struggle, the immigration rights struggle, the women's struggle, the LGBTQ struggle, and the anti-war issues and the defects and faults in the Democratic Party, and try to build a mass movement, which has been the only thing that's ever made fundamental change in this country.
Got a lot of work ahead of you.
Yeah.
Did you have any feelings about the fall of Saigon? Like when you heard about the news?
You mean the liberation of Ho Chi Minh City?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. What was it, January 1st?
Yeah.
When they marched into formerly the city formerly known as Saigon. Well, yeah, it was tremendous. It was also the end of an era. I mean, anti-war work had defined us. Although by that time, I was, getting really interested in labor struggles. During that time in Newport, I also worked as a factory worker, General Motors, General Electric, great stories from that time. And a very short career as a New England deep water fisherman, which also has some stories. My mother's father, besides being a union organizer and printer, was also a whaler. So we have a little background there too. And I did get a chance to participate in deep water fishing, which was, an incredible experience. Really, talk about, standing next to a Portuguese fisherman who spoke no English, and the two of us are pulling up a trap net with the fish jumping out into the sky and the seagulls flying down and the sun blazing over us. It is, that's where your fish comes from. And the feeling of camaraderie of all these, fishermen in a circle pulling up this net, 3 miles off the coast. I didn't last long, but that was
An experience.
the experience. Yeah. And a lot of things like that. The different, driving cab in Norfolk and picking up sailors and picking up 3 sailors from Mali. No, not Mali. Where were they from? They were from one of the Pacific islands. They were, very dark skinned, and they had short dreads, and they didn't speak English. And one of them was totally drunk, and his 2 friends were carrying him to the cab, and then from the cab to the boat. And it was just like, I really felt privileged to be able to watch that. Their friendship. And, you get drunk in a strange country and you got people who are going to carry you back to your boat. That's good. That's a good thing. So, to have all these different experiences and to talk to people who, to drive down to, I didn't, for the last 25 years, I've been making a living installing artwork after the printing trade changed so much. To computers. My skills were just, outdated. So I started hanging pictures, and I've done that in 28 states, coast to coast, border to border. and I've done so many military bases that I pulled up one time at Fort Bragg during the bombing of Yugoslavia, wondering what the hell I was doing on a U.S. military base during this war. And the Marine Guard at the gate said, "Hey, Phil, you're back." Um, so, you know, yeah. Um, what was the question?
We were talking about at the end of the war, or the end of
Oh,
the,
yeah. Well, it was the end of, it was not just the end of the war, it was the end of that phase of the anti-war movement. Now, the organizations, continued, but the work that I was doing, GI organizing, I could see that was not going to be work on the same level. Um, you just weren't going to be able to sustain that kind of a movement. So that was, about the time, yeah, about the time I joined Workers' World. Um, that was when I got arrested at the shootout at the Black Panther Party office, which helped me join because I wasn't getting along with the group at the time. Um, Want to hear that story?
sure,
Okay, it's got nothing to do with the Vietnam War, but
activism.
yeah, we had the Defense Committee and the Panther Party chapter in Norfolk had morphed into the Black Community News Service, which was affiliated with the Elbridge Cleaver wing of the party, which was arguing that they needed to build a Black Liberation Army and go underground and conduct the struggle underground. So, we were friends with them, and one day we got a letter addressed that was meant for them, but that was delivered to our post office box. So I went down and to bring them the letter. And while I was there, they had been harassed by the police a lot lately, especially this one guy named Lawrence Waller, who's descended from Kunta Kinte. Yeah, and his family is from that area. So, of Virginia. And so while I was there, there was a fella who was wandering around in the street, an older guy. I don't know whether he was drunk or high or just disoriented. But the police pulled up, and I guess they were going to take him in. And two young guys from the street said, "We know him. We'll take care of him." So they started to walk him off, and I was standing at the entrance to the office, the Black Community News Service office, with Veronica Waller, Lawrence's wife, and we were looking at what was going on, and she said, "Look at these cops, the way they act," because they looked like they were going to arrest the guy. Well, one of the cops was driving by and heard her say that, and he stopped the car and went in to arrest her. So she walked into the office and sat down on, leaned up against the office desk, and she's a little slip of a woman. She maybe have been 5'3", maybe 110 pounds. And the cop came up and he says, "Come with me." And she started to get up, and he grabbed her and he pulled her. And I said, "Hey, you don't have to treat the woman like that." Well, two cops jumped me, threw me to the floor, then pulled me up, brought me outside. They'd already put her in the back of the police car sitting in front of the office, and they threw me in the back of the police car. And then they went in, back inside. Well, next thing I know, is pop, 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 pop. And I thought, is that firecrackers? And then this guy, this civilian who had been walking down the street and got swept into the office when the police went in. I don't know exactly how, Alfonso Boone, he comes staggering out with a bullet wound in his leg. And then a cop shot. So next thing I know, there's all these cops, rushing into the scene, and one's leaning over the front of the car like this, and I dive for the floor, and Veronica's sitting there upright going, "These folks are crazy." And so I meekly got back up again. And then they took us downtown and put us in a holding cell. And sometime and spent the night there. Sometime in the night, two cops walked in and looked at me and said, "He even looks like a piece of shit." So I wasn't sure what's going to happen. It turns out Alonzo Boone was arrested and got beat up in the elevator on the way up. But I guess they didn't do it because I was white. They claimed, then they arrested Wayne Credle, who was kind of the leader of the group, claiming that he's the one that shot the cop. And he wasn't even there. He went down when he heard on the news that something had happened. So they arrested him. So he's in the cell around the corner from me. So I'm finding out, I'm finding out what happened, and this is pretty serious. So yeah, so Wayne got charged with attempted murder, and so we went to court, and there was a defense committee formed, and because there was Veronica and me and Wayne and myself, so it's a Church Street Four, and they hired an attorney. The attorney bargained for 6 months, for 30 days in jail. And I said, no. Well, for what? We didn't do anything. So we demanded, to go to trial. And when they went to trial, the cops were so arrogant, they didn't bother getting their story straight. So there was a black judge who was skeptical of police, and we got off with 30 days suspended and sentenced. And Wayne was acquitted. And a year later, Lawrence Waller turned himself in. And got off. He was acquitted. And this was not national news. It was just quietly done and just going to let it go. So, yeah, that was, so I had been, I had been arguing with Workers' World about different things, but I had finally decided I wanted to join. And basically, I read a lot more Marxism and Lenin, trying to come up with arguments against them. And it turned out Lenin always agreed with them. So I had to go with my hat in my hand and ask to join, and they didn't want me. But then when I got arrested at Church Street, then I was legit. So they gave me an especially long probation period, but I wound up in the national leadership. So, yeah, that was just a war story.
Uh-huh. Well, let me look through my list of questions and make sure that we address them. Of the organizations you joined, which did you feel were least effective and why?
Least effective? Well, that's a hard question because they were all effective. That's why I joined them. I would join an organization if it enabled me to struggle better. I joined the Boston Draft Resistance Group because they were counseling and they were organizing a local draft board and they were reaching out, to people going into the military. I joined Workers' World because they took this tremendously courageous stand in Boston and turned back this wave of, racist terror. I joined the United National Anti-War Coalition because I believed in the principles, which were, against all U.S. wars and intervention. There were no good U.S. wars, or sanctions, or blockades, or assassinations, or anything else. U.S. foreign policy is to benefit U.S. corporations and not the people of this country, and they oppress people all over the world, and it's all wrong. So, and then I left them when my criticisms were getting stronger and it seemed less possible. In both cases, I raised criticisms within the organization and realized I wasn't going to win the argument. And I left without attacking the groups because I don't think that's helpful. But I just tried to develop, an independent effort that demonstrated a different set of principles. And I think the Defenders have been the most successful activist, volunteer activist organization in Richmond, certainly since 2000. And I can't speak before that because I wasn't here. But, Shockoe Bottom is not going to be a collection of parking lots much longer. And that's important. And the statues are down, and even though we didn't physically tear them down, we worked on it for decades, since 2007, and laid the basis for that, and have exposed police murders, some of which went to court, some of which cops were punished, and we've done a lot of good work, and supporting other struggles, and maintaining good relationships with all communities and being there during immigrant raids. And uh, so, and then we're, pushed local coalitions to come out for gay marriage long before that was an issue. So I'm proud of the work. So the newspaper will continue. And I'm going to be spending more time writing um, and writing books for the general public about difficult subjects that I think with with the Iran book, I was really pleased that in addition to some attention that it got in the anti-war movement, friends of ours who would never think about a foreign policy issue, a woman who owned a restaurant, a guy who retired from a local factory, read the book and were really moved by it. So I think it's, I think if we have a skill, it's explaining difficult situations in a popular way, and that's really needed at this point. So that's going forward. That's what. Although when the fire bell rings, the dog perks up its ears, can't avoid trying to get on the fire truck. So Anna says, you're never going to stop.
Yeah.
So,
It's your life's
but
work.
besides Anna's work, which is a whole, other subject, uh, what she's done. And I would be remiss in saying that she has been my political partner for 20 years, and did go to Iran with me the second time, and did support work on the first trip and on the trip to Ukraine. I mean, she held down the fort and legal and backup. And of course, the charcoal bottom struggle, which she has really emerged as the leader of, um, and is now teaching at VCU in the African American Studies Department. Because after 10 years of activism, she decided to go back to school and get a master's degree in history, which gave her the credibility that we were somewhat lacking before. So, yeah.
Can you talk about your dad, how you and your dad kind of reconciled his beliefs and his service in World War II and your activism and how he ended up supporting you in the end?
Well, it's really to his credit because Dad, growing up as he did, his mother died when he was 8, spent 8 years in foster homes. His father was abusive, and he wanted a family. He wanted a stable, loving family. That was his goal in life. And his challenge was he had severe PTSD. So, and he could be a bully. But he really wanted to be a good man. And so he wanted a good relationship with me. So when I went to work in the factory, actually, he relaxed a little bit because I wasn't just doing odd jobs. And then when I went to work as a printer, he was proud of that, and he came to visit me in New York and came up and saw the press and all of that, and he had mellowed on the war issue, and when I went to work for the Richmond Free Press, which is a black newspaper, he would show the newspaper to his friends, um, you know, and he was quite proud of that. And he and Ma came down and visit, and they came to the office and met Ray Boone, the publisher and editor, who was a figure, important figure in his own right. And it was so funny because I thought, what do these two people possibly have in common? And Dad was wearing this kind of camel hair jacket that Ma bought him. She wanted him to have one nice jacket, so she bought this expensive jacket for him. And he wore it because of her. He didn't care about stuff like that. But Ray picked up on it because Ray was very attuned to fashion, and he wanted to be able to walk into any room and be on any level with anybody who was there. And he knew the manufacturer. And he said, "Is that a such and such?" And Dad said, "I don't know. It's not Robert Hall." And anyway, and so Ray was like quite impressed. And so we had our picture taken. by Sandra Sellers, one of their photographers. So I have that framed in my office now, the mom and dad and Ray and me. And so he was proud of, Ma always felt like I was the one that kept some kind of a class and social consciousness that the others kids had in the beginning. They were all activists, back in the 60s. But later, not so much. So they're all liberal Democrats now. Um, and, good people, but not, not activists in that sense. Um, but Dad, he wanted to be close, and it was still difficult. And when he got older, he developed some dementia. He made it to 92. He had leukemia also. Um, and the night that he passed, he got lucid, and apparently this happens with people with dementia. And he came out. He had been, in a hospital bed in the apartment. Ma wouldn't let him go in a nursing home. She spent the last 3 years as his primary caregiver. With the rest of us helping. But he came out to dinner, and then he went home, went back to his room, and I went in and sat with him, and we had this long talk um, about growing up, and we told each other a lot of important things, and it was really. And Ma was listening from the next room, and she said later she was really pleased. Um, that it sounded like we had really finally reconciled. The middle of the night, he got up to go to the bathroom and collapsed, and we got him back into bed. We called the hospice nurse, and she came out and she gave him some morphine, and it was just Mom and me with him, and Ma's on one side of the bed, I'm the other, and we're holding his hands, and he's fighting. You can see he's fighting, and Ma said, "Let it go, Hank." She says, "This is one war you can't win." She says, "He's hanging on for me. He doesn't want to leave me. He wants to protect me." So he finally passed. And Ma said, "Phil, what day is it? What's the date?" I said, "It's February 28th." And I said to myself, she's going to remember this day for the rest of her life. She said, "If he had hung on one more day, I would have got his Social Security." I said, "Ma, how can you say something like that now?" And she said, "Well, that's what he was thinking." So, and I said that at his funeral, well, because they were children of the Depression. Yeah, he would have one more day. She would have got the next month's Social Security. It kind of typifies both of them, and yeah, it was really a privilege to know him and her. Um, so, yeah, that we reconciled. Yeah.
That's good. Well, are there any questions that you wished I had asked you about your activism in the Vietnam War?
Was it worth it?
Was it worth it?
I mean, when Ma passed, we sold her condo. That's really what she had, but it was a condo in Massachusetts. So my share was enough for us to put a down payment on the house and have a few dollars. So I, the pandemic support we got was enough to get us out of debt. So we were, just out of debt. But now, we're not so worried about money and stuff. Um, but most of my life, I've been what I call movement poor. It's not the same thing as being poor, but you don't have any more money, but you just don't have the psychological oppression. Um, but when I left New York, I had a $40,000 pension. When I moved to Richmond 7 years later, I was $40,000 in debt. I went through 2 bankruptcies. Um, I had no money, and that was because making money. I spent the money on organizing. And I've been stupid about money, just really, really stupid. um, just sort of done different things with it. I don't mean I was spendthrift. I just mean, I could have invested it here or there. I could have kept my pension. Um, But in terms of being it worth it, um, you know, I really liked Henry David Thoreau when I was a kid. I read his book Walden in high school. Although my English teacher came up to me in the study hall and said, "You know, that's not an adventure story," which I thought was kind of a stupid thing for the English. Like, okay, well then I won't read it, you know. But I liked Henry David Thoreau a lot. I liked that idealism. Um, and of course, I had been in a seminary, and it wasn't just the regular priesthood; it was the Carmelite monks. So they take poverty, chastity, and obedience. You know, I wanted to be a missionary in Peru and ride a horse around the mountains and visiting villages. That was my goal. I probably would have been killed by the Shining Path communist organization, but that's another story. But you know, so the idea of you know, and being Catholic, you know, you want discipline. You want to discipline. Then you want to rebel against it. You want both. So being in the workers' world was good because it was a structure, but I could, you know, I could also bump heads. Um, but what the movement has given me was, I mean, it got me out of that neurotic, scared, terrified little kid, where you know I could go to Odessa thinking that there was a real good chance we were going to be killed, but go. Um, that was the scariest thing I've ever done. Um, but it was also one of the most rewarding experiences. So the most important thing to me has always been integrity. You know, have principles and follow them, and no matter what the consequences are. And then you can look at yourself in the mirror. And then you're never going to wake up in your 50s or your 60s and say, I don't know where I went wrong. I don't know where I gave up my ideas. I don't know where I gave up my dreams. I've never had that feeling. You know, I've never had that. And that has been that's been my reward, my satisfaction. Um, you know, you get your name in the paper once in a while, you know, people pat you on the back, and then 6 months later they don't know who you are, or they criticize you for something you didn't do. And anyway, life is just that's, you know, that comes and goes. But the, the feeling that you know, you met the challenges of your time, whether or not you won, whether or not you succeeded, you gave it your best shot. And that's what Gabriel did. He was hung, he was executed, his rebellion failed, but he's one of this country's greatest heroes ever. Um, you know, for his strategic thinking, for his vision, for his courage, for his personal sacrifice. Um, he, he he couldn't have been a better he couldn't have been a bigger hero if he had succeeded. So you know, it's better to succeed, but you know, knowing that you met life's moral and political challenges the best of your ability, I think is the best reward. So,
That made it worth it.
oh, I wouldn't have, I don't regret a single moment, you know, of the whole thing. Made mistakes, wish there were things I'd done differently, you know, have some regrets, but not in terms of the trajectory. No, no, that was a gift. That was a total gift.
Well, thank you for giving us your time and speaking to us about your experiences and
I should talk more about Anna. She's going to kill me.
um, and I'm glad you've met your match and you guys are forging your way forward.
Oh, it's a great partnership. It's just a terrific partnership. Yeah. It was funny too because we went to the supermarket last night. God, she looked good. Um, she's 62. No, 63. She's turned 63. She's a beautiful woman, and sometimes she really shines, you know. And of course, like everybody, you know, we're concerned about our looks, um, even as we get old. But we look good last night in the supermarket. I said, you know, we really look good. And that was, you know, that because I said, and you know, I'm telling the truth because I'm shallow like that. So, but yeah, when you do histories and stuff, I mean, her story is so incredible because you know she's descended from people who were sold out of Shockoe Bottom, or at least Richmond. You know, I don't know if they actually went through Shockoe Bottom, and she was born in California. You know, her father is a world famous sculptor. He has a piece on permanent exhibit next door called Anna's Corner, named after her. Yeah, it's a barbed wire piece blocking off a corner as if she's being punished. He says it's more than that, but I don't know. They've even done father-daughter programs here. Um, and she wasn't politically active, when we met. But the chocolate bottom struggle really got her. And then, like I said, she went back to school. And now she's, a recognized public historian who's sought after in all kinds of conferences and so on. And she's teaching she's coordinating the introductory course in the African American Studies Department for incoming freshmen on race and racism, which I'm convinced that Youngkin is going to zero in on. It was supposed to be mandatory, and for some reason the university made it optional, which I think was, I suspect was Youngkin pressure. But the department has just issued an extremely strong statement on Gaza, really strong. And if they don't get attacked from that, there's no justice in this world. Yeah.
How did you and Anna meet?
Well, that's an interesting story. I was working as a reporter for the Richmond Free Press, and she was communications director for the group Homeward, which coordinates homeless services in the city, or tries to. And they had a conference. So I was assigned to go cover the conference. So I met her, and I got some materials, and I had to call her up for some follow-up phone calls. And she has the nicest voice. Really, it's a seductive voice. So I was Googling her, and I only found one picture of her from a company she used to work for. But I found reasons to make follow-up phone calls. And then she called me up and said that she's an artist, and she was giving an exhibition of her artwork at a barber shop in Oregon Hill, Pine Street barbershop that was doing shows. And I said, well, we don't usually cover, art shows. And she said, well, actually, I was just inviting you. I said, oh. I said, have you put up the pictures yet? She said, no. I said, well, my side job is I install artwork. So we got together and we hung the pictures together. Aww. And then I asked her if she'd like to go out for coffee. And she said, okay. I said, well, how about we make it breakfast? So we went out for breakfast at the Hill Street Cafe. And it was a bright, shiny day. And she came in. I was sitting facing the windows. So when she came in, I really couldn't see her face. It was only the second time I had met her. And she was also wearing a big floppy hat. So she sat down across from me and we were talking. And so we got into a little bit in politics, and I was trying to figure out, where she might be coming from. I said, what nationality are you? And she said, mixed race, African American. She's Norwegian on her mother's side. I said, okay. So that was interesting. And I started throwing out a few little political things, and she'd go, yeah. And so I put out a little bit more, and she said, yeah. And I upped it, and pretty soon we're talking about socialist revolution, and she's going, yeah. And I thought, wow, this is, so I asked her, if she'd like to go for a picnic. Well, it turns out she says, yeah, whenever somebody tells her something, because she's acknowledging that you said it. It doesn't mean she agrees with you. But by this time, I think I found this, this soulmate. So we went out to picnic at Pony Pasture, and I realized I had no idea what she'd like to eat. She could be vegetarian, could be vegan. So I bought $85 worth of food. And we went out and sat in the river for 3 hours and been together ever since.
Wonderful.
It was a combination of reporter and public relations person, artist, and art installer.
You worked together well.
Yeah, and then, 4 years later we got married and been together ever since. And, and we help each other, and, I edit some things that she writes, and she edits everything that I write. And so and now we bought this house together, which I said, this is more serious than getting married. I'd never owned a house, and now I own a house with you, and we're in debt for the next 30 years. I mean, this is a real commitment.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more stories, but I'm sure you got other things to do.
We're good, but we're good. Yeah.
This is my day.
I can tell you how we met, how I proposed.
Okay, tell us that.
All right, but that's the last one.
Okay.
Okay. So, we were going together, and I was living in Church Hill. It was really crappy apartment, but it was only $350 a month. Um, Me and my cat, who did not like Anna, did not like her coming over, used to attack her. They had it out one day, straightened out. But I got sick, and I guess I had the flu, and I had a terrible cough, and I also was getting the hiccups, like for a day. I mean, I was a wreck. So I was just staying at home, and Anna was bringing me food, and so she got some cough medicine, and it was Delsum, and it had just recently come off prescription. It was now over the counter. It's like twice as strong as Robitussin. It's really good stuff. You're supposed to take it, a certain amount each day. But I found that when I had the hiccups, I was taking some antibiotics, I think, and if I washed it down with water, I would get the hiccups, and they wouldn't go away for the longest time. But if I washed it down with Delsum, it was okay. So I was drinking a lot of Delsum, and it's hallucinogenic. Kids use it for parties. So Anna started noticing that, I was asking for a lot of Delsum. And then she noticed that there were bottles under the bed, and there was a lot of Delsum. And I started having these incredible dreams. It wasn't when I was awake, but when I fell asleep, it was the most amazing things. I dreamt I was an Englishman traveling in Georgia in the 1930s, and I couldn't understand anybody's accent, because I was from England. I dreamt there was a little black family, a cartoon family, that came to visit me one night. Um, and yeah, and we had conversations. I dreamt one time Anna's son Taimir was there, but he wasn't. I dreamt that there was about the Fort Pillow massacre, and something about walls that were shimmering and translucent and liquid and just unbelievably beautiful. And then I dreamt about a carousel, and I was riding this carousel, and I was going around, and there was a brass ring. And I kept reaching for the brass ring, and I couldn't catch it. And finally, on the last turn, I grabbed the ring, and I realized I needed to marry Anna. That was the brass ring. That was, somehow that made everything come together. So she came over, that night, and I proposed to her. And she said yes. But she said, but you have to sober up.
Get off the Delta.
Get off the deli. Yeah. And so I did, but I mean, not after, so many other things happened. I thought I died at one point. I thought I was fainting, and I've never fainted. I don't faint. And I thought I was fainting, and I thought I was dying. And I saw my life pass before me. And I felt, yeah, that was all right. I didn't do everything I wanted to do, but that was okay. I felt really at peace. But it wasn't. I was just hallucinating. So anyway, I got sober. It took me 2 weeks before I could drive. We went to the hospital, and the doctor said, you've got this, you overdosed on this, this thing, and it'll be gone in 24 hours. Well, it wasn't. It lasted, much longer. But anyway, so after I sobered up, and I've never done drugs, a little marijuana before the Potemkin, but once we got political, we didn't do any drugs. Why hand them the weapon, So I asked her out, and we went down to Charco Slip, and we had a glass of champagne, and we went over to that little courtyard thing that's down there, and we sat on the bench. I already got the ring. So I went out to Willow Lawn and went to Jared's, because that's all I knew. They go to Jared's. And I couldn't afford anything at Jared's. I was really broke. And I called in. So I went outside, and there was a little kiosk that sold rings. So, they were much cheaper. So I called in, and I said, hypothetically, if you were going to buy a ring, what size would you buy? And she said, a 7. I think it was a 7. I said, okay. So I went in and talked to the person. I said, what's the difference between an engagement ring and a wedding ring? And she said, well, an engagement ring is a ring you get for your engagement, and a wedding ring is a ring you get for your wedding. I said, yeah, what's the difference? I mean, so she said, so she showed me this ring. It was $50. So I said, okay, well, I'll take two. No, no, did I? I forget how it went. This is my wedding ring. Anyway, no, that's right. I got her an engagement ring. It was about $50. Then we got the wedding rings. So I pulled out we were in chocolate slip, and I pulled out the ring, and I got down on one knee, and I said, "Will you marry me?" And she said, "Yes." And across the street, there was somebody sitting there, and I thought they were kind of watching us. The next day, in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, there was a story about a man proposing to his fiancée in chocolate slip, about a guy who had rented a medieval knight's costume and a white horse and got his fiance's girlfriends to pull her out of the tavern at the exact moment when he trotted down the street, got out on one knee and proposed to her. And I was so fucking pissed. That was not fair. It was the same night. But anyway, that's how it goes. So, yeah,
It's a very happy story.
I owe it all to cough medicine.
Well, thank you so much.